Beneath the rolling hills of southeastern Turkey lies a place older than the pyramids, older even than the first cities. A windswept mound of stone and earth, silent for millennia, concealed a mystery that would shake the foundations of history. This place is known as Göbekli Tepe, a temple complex carved 12,000 years ago, when humanity was thought to be no more than scattered bands of hunters and gatherers. Here, towering T-shaped pillars rise from the earth, some weighing more than 20 tons, etched with lions, vultures, serpents, and forgotten symbols. They stand in deliberate circles, as though forming a gathering place for gods, ancestors, or forces we no longer understand. Its builders left no written word, no trace of their names, only immense stones whispering of a world before recorded time. Who raised these monoliths, and why? Were they the work of early tribes taking their first steps towards civilization, or the echo of knowledge carried from an even older age now lost to memory? Tonight we journey back 12,000 years to walk among the stones of Göbekli Tepe and to ask quietly, who really built this ancient sanctuary? Could Göbekli Tepe belong to this same continuum of ritual? The scattered human fragments suggest it. The vultures carved in stone all but declare it. To place the body under the sky, to allow birds to carry away its flesh, was to participate in a cosmic cycle, the transformation of mortal remains into the eternal. Death was not an end, but a passage, a breaking down of form so that the essence might endure. And yet, the evidence is ambiguous. Some scholars argue that the bones tell another story. Perhaps the cut marks reflect not ritual exposure, but communal feasting, where the meat of animals, and perhaps, rarely, of humans, was shared among participants. In this view, Göbekli Tepe was a place of gathering, where ritual banquets sealed bonds between clans, and the discarded fragments of bone, human or animal, mingled in the earth as remnants of celebration rather than death rites. Chapter 1. The Discovery of Göbekli Tepe, a sun-scorched hill in southeastern Turkey. In the summer of 1994, an archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt stumbled upon a site that would quietly upend the story of human history. What seemed at first like a nondescript mound, one among many dotting the landscape, would reveal itself as a buried sanctuary, older and more mysterious than anything yet known. For decades, local farmers had ploughed the slopes of Göbekli Tepe, turning up odd fragments of carved stone. Shepherds grazed their flocks across the ridge without suspecting that beneath their feet lay circles of monolithic pillars, arranged with geometric precision and preserved under thousands of tons of backfill. The mound itself, its name meaning Potbelly Hill in Turkish, hid its secret well, shielded for nearly 12,000 years by its deliberate burial. When Schmidt arrived, he was already familiar with the region's early Neolithic sites. He had trained his eye to notice irregularities in stone, to recognize not chance but design. What he saw here, a scattering of flint tools and limestone fragments, told him he was standing above something greater. Excavation confirmed his intuition. As layers of soil were peeled away, the tops of massive T-shaped monoliths emerged, their surfaces carved with animals in crisp relief, their forms too deliberate, too vast, to be dismissed as simple markers. These stones dated back to around 9600 BCE, at least 6,000 years before Stonehenge, 7,000 before the pyramids of Giza. The chronology alone staggered archaeologists. Humanity was not supposed to build monuments of this scale before farming, before cities, before writing. Yet here was a sanctuary so monumental that it forced the rewriting of nearly every assumption about the order in which civilization was born. The pillars themselves rose as high as 5 meters, weighing up to 20 tons. They were arranged not at random, but in carefully constructed circles, with 2 towering stones at the center of each enclosure, facing one another as if locked in eternal dialogue. Surrounding them, smaller pillars formed rings, their sockets carved directly into the bedrock. This was no camp, no accidental scatter of stones. It was deliberate, intentional, and symbolic. Schmidt quickly realized the magnitude of what had been uncovered. Until then, scholars assumed that agriculture gave rise to complex societies and that religious architecture followed. The model was neat and comforting. First survival, then surplus, then temples. But Göbekli Tepe inverted that story. Here were hunter-gatherers, people with no pottery, no metal, no cities, erecting the first known monumental sanctuary in human history. The question was inescapable. Did religion, not farming, provide the spark of civilization? Could the demands of ritual, gatherings, feasts, construction have created the need for farming rather than the other way around? The mystery deepened with every trench. Carvings of foxes, lions, vultures, and serpents adorned the stones, alive with symbolism but silent about their exact meaning. Some pillars bore abstract shapes, others stylized human forms, complete with arms, hands, and belts. The iconography suggested a world in which human, animal, and divine were intertwined, where stone itself was animated with presence. And yet, alongside the awe, questions multiplied. Who had carved these stones? How many hands were needed to drag them into place? With no beasts of burden, no wheels, only stone tools, the labor alone would have demanded extraordinary coordination. Did scattered bands of hunter-gatherers unite seasonally to build? Were they bound by ritual obligation, by shared myth, or by something else entirely? Göbekli Tepe also confounded expectations in what it lacked. There were no signs of ordinary settlement, no houses, no hearths, no domestic refuse. This was not a village but a place set apart, perhaps a pilgrimage center where disparate groups converged. If so, it may represent the earliest known example of sacred space deliberately distinguished from daily life. The timing of its discovery was equally significant. For years, Göbekli Tepe lay overlooked, even though its stones protruded from the earth. In the 1960s, a brief survey dismissed the mound as an unremarkable Byzantine cemetery. The assumption that nothing earlier could lie beneath blinded the investigators to its deeper story. Only Schmidt, decades later, with the patience to look again, recognized that what others had mistaken for gravestones were in fact the exposed tops of megaliths 12 millennia old. This oversight speaks to a deeper theme in archaeology, that often it is not the absence of evidence, but the lens through which evidence is seen that shapes our understanding of the past. Göbekli Tepe had always been there, but the world was not ready to see it. As excavations expanded, the true scale of the sanctuary began to emerge. Enclosures dotted the mound, layered atop one another, some still buried, others partially revealed. The site extended far beyond the first circle, suggesting that what had been uncovered was only a fragment of a vast complex. And beneath it all, the soil held the fingerprints of time. Flint blades dulled from carving, animal bones cracked from feasting, human fragments hinting at ritual. For Schmidt, Göbekli Tepe became not just a site but a lifelong mission. He worked there until his death in 2014, convinced that this sanctuary represented a turning point in human history. He called it the Cathedral on the Hill, the world's first great temple. Yet he was cautious too. He knew the temptation to impose modern categories on ancient minds. Temple, religion, civilization. These words carry meanings that may not fit a world 10,000 years distant. What Göbekli Tepe was to its builders remains beyond certainty. And still, beneath the soil, secrets wait. Only a fraction of the mound has been excavated, less than 10% by most estimates. What lies buried in the unexcavated portions may yet change the story again. The possibility that more enclosures, more carvings, perhaps even entirely different phases of construction lie concealed, keeps the site alive with anticipation. The discovery of Göbekli Tepe shattered the neat chronology of prehistory and opened a door onto a chapter of humanity long forgotten. It revealed that long before writing, long before kings and empires, people gathered in vast sanctuaries to carve stone, to honor mysteries, and perhaps to reimagine themselves in relation to the cosmos. But the discovery also left us with a haunting silence. The stones tell us they were arranged with care, adorned with meaning, erected with devotion. They tell us that something profound compelled people to gather here, yet they do not tell us why. In this silence, archaeology meets myth. Was Göbekli Tepe the birthplace of organized religion, the crucible of agriculture, or the sanctuary of a vanished symbolic order? The answer remains buried, waiting for patient hands to uncover it. The story begins with its discovery, but what it truly represents lies beyond. Like the stones themselves, standing mute yet filled with presence, Göbekli Tepe's unearthing is not a conclusion, but an invitation into mystery. Chapter 2. The southeastern Anatolia landscape. To understand Göbekli Tepe, one must first understand the land in which it rises. For the sanctuary does not exist in isolation. It is rooted in a landscape that shaped, and was shaped by, the earliest stirrings of civilization. Göbekli Tepe sits high upon a limestone ridge, its summit commanding the Harran Plain below. From here, the horizon stretches open in every direction, unbroken save for the undulating ridges that ripple toward the Mesopotamian basin. To the north, the Taurus Mountains rise, their slopes once covered with forests of oak and pistachio. To the south, the plains run almost endlessly, a natural corridor that for millennia has carried herds, travelers, and ideas. This vantage point, half fortress, half stage, makes Göbekli Tepe a place both of watchfulness and gathering. 12,000 years ago, this landscape was not as dry as it appears today. At the dawn of the Holocene, climate shifts brought more temperate conditions. Grasses flourished, rivers swelled with seasonal rains, and wild herds crossed the plains. The land formed part of what archaeologists call the Fertile Crescent, the great arc stretching from the Levant across Mesopotamia and into Anatolia. Here, wild ancestors of wheat and barley grew in abundance. Gazelle and aurochs, wild sheep and goats, moved in their seasonal rhythms. This was a world alive with opportunity for foragers, offering both food and materials in profusion. It is no coincidence that the earliest evidence of plant domestication comes from these very ridges. Einkorn wheat, genetically traced to slopes less than 30 kilometers from Göbekli Tepe, reveals that this was a threshold zone, a place where human hands first intervened in the cycles of the wild, reshaping plants into crops. The same can be said for animals. Here, on this plateau and its surrounding plains, the bones of wild sheep and goats gradually give way to signs of domestication. In this sense, Göbekli Tepe's builders lived not at the end of an age, but at its beginning, balanced between the freedom of foraging and the tether of farming. The sanctuary's location speaks to more than subsistence. Standing atop the plateau, one feels suspended between two realms, the earth below teeming with herds and grain, and the vault of sky above, vast and unbroken. To choose such a place for their great circles of stone was to anchor ritual in a liminal zone, bridging ground and heavens. The hilltop offered not only visibility, but symbolism, an elevated stage where ceremony might be witnessed not only by humans, but by the cosmos itself. Archaeologists have often asked whether Göbekli Tepe's position was purely practical. Did the builders select it simply because limestone lay near the surface, easily quarried for monoliths? Or was its placement above the Harran Plain deliberate, ensuring the sanctuary overlooked the hunting grounds that sustained its people? The evidence suggests both are true. Quarry scars near the site reveal that stone was abundant and accessible, yet this does not explain why the builders lifted their sanctuary here rather than in the valleys below. For practical ease, they might have built where water flowed and plants thrived. Instead, they raised their monuments on barren ridges, where survival was harder but the sky was closer. The environment itself seems to invite ritual. The limestone bedrock forms a natural stage, its pale surfaces gleaming beneath the sun, its contours echoing with wind. Even today, the silence is profound, broken only by the calls of distant birds. In Neolithic times, gatherings here would have been infused with atmosphere. Firelight flickering against stone, chants carried across the open air, the movements of stars and moon unobscured by forest or mountain. In such a setting, ceremony could not help but feel cosmological. The Harran Plain below also carried meaning. Archaeological surveys reveal that this region was crisscrossed by seasonal migrations, gazelle herds moving in great numbers, pursued by groups of hunters. Excavations at nearby sites show mass kills of gazelle, animals driven into corrals or ravines, their bones left in heaps. Such abundance suggests not only feasting, but coordination among groups. In this light, Göbekli Tepe may have been situated where people already converged for seasonal hunts, turning gatherings of necessity into gatherings of ritual. Water, too, shaped the choice of landscape. Though no river flows beside Göbekli Tepe, small springs and seasonal streams dot the limestone ridges. Archaeologists have found cisterns carved into the bedrock near the site, evidence that its builders captured and stored rainwater to sustain their gatherings. Such engineering hints at foresight and permanence, yet it also raises questions. Was water managed purely for practical needs, or did it carry symbolic value? Across the ancient Near East, springs were revered as portals, thresholds between worlds. Perhaps the water at Göbekli Tepe was as sacred as the stones themselves. When we step back, the wider region magnifies the mystery. To the west lies Karahan Tepe, another site of T-shaped pillars, carved in chambers sunk into the bedrock. To the north and east, lesser-known sites like Sefer Tepe and Tasla Tepe reveal similar traditions. Göbekli Tepe was not a solitary anomaly, but part of a broader cultural landscape, a network of sanctuaries raised by peoples whose worldview remains obscured. The southeastern Anatolia plateau was their stage, and Göbekli Tepe, its crown. The symbolism of the hill itself cannot be ignored. Across cultures, high places draw the sacred. Mountaintops, ridges, and plateaus have long been seen as bridges to the heavens, liminal zones where the divine touches earth. Was Göbekli Tepe chosen for this reason? Did its builders seek to place themselves between earth and sky, to carve their symbols into a landscape where visibility was both literal and spiritual? The barren ridges, stripped of vegetation, would have heightened this impression. With no walls to block the horizon, the sanctuary stood exposed, part of the cosmos it sought to engage. Modern archaeology reminds us to tread carefully. To the builders, the land was not simply backdrop but participant. The animals they hunted, the plants they gathered, the stones they quarried, all were part of a living world. To carve vultures into limestone, to raise foxes and serpents in relief, was to inscribe the land itself with memory. In this sense, the southeastern Anatolia landscape was both provider and canvas, its contours inseparable from the sanctuary built upon them. Yet questions linger. Did the choice of site emerge from practical concerns alone, or from mythic geography known only to its builders? Did they see this hill as a place of first creation, a navel of the world? Or was it simply where their seasonal paths converged, transformed over time into sacred ground? Archaeology offers fragments, but no final answer. What remains clear is that Göbekli Tepe was not built in isolation from its environment. The limestone ridge, the fertile plains, the migration routes of herds, the first fields of wild wheat, all converged here. This was a landscape at a turning point, carrying humanity across the threshold from wildness into cultivation, from foraging into settlement, from survival into symbolism. And yet, the stones still ask, was the sanctuary a product of its landscape, or was the landscape itself transformed into sanctuary by the presence of the stones? The answer, like the horizon from Göbekli Tepe's summit, remains open, stretching endlessly into the distance. Chapter 3. The T-shaped pillars at the core of Göbekli Tepe. Beyond the windswept plateau and the scars of ancient quarries, rise the forms that have captured the world's imagination, the T-shaped pillars. These immense monoliths, some weighing up to 20 tons and standing more than 5 meters tall, are more than stone. They are symbols, embodiments, and presences. Their outlines are stark, angular, and deliberate, cut into the shape of a massive T. To modern eyes, they may seem abstract, but when viewed closely, their silence begins to speak. The T is no simple form. Many of these pillars carry carved details, arms folded downward along their shafts, hands clasped at the waist, belts encircling the torso, even loincloths etched faintly into limestone. These details reveal what archaeologists now agree upon. The T-shapes are not arbitrary markers of space, but stylized human beings. They are the largest human-like sculptures of their time, towering over the very people who raised them. Each enclosure at Göbekli Tepe contains these monoliths arranged in circles or ovals, with 2 larger central pillars facing each other. Around them stand smaller, though still imposing stones, guardians encircling their monumental counterparts. The symmetry is striking. The twin pillars dominate the enclosures like presiding figures, as though locked in eternal dialogue. Their faceless, abstract forms suggest not individuals, but archetypes. They may represent deities, ancestors, or mythic beings whose names and stories have long since vanished. The effort required to create these figures is staggering. The limestone was quarried directly from the bedrock around the hill, cut using stone hammers and flint tools. Archaeological surveys have found unfinished pillars lying in nearby quarries, some partially detached from the bedrock, frozen in the act of being carved. Transporting such monoliths required not only strength but extraordinary coordination. Without wheels or beasts of burden, the builders likely dragged them on sledges, using ropes, levers, and manpower in numbers difficult to imagine. Raising them upright demanded ingenuity and social organization equal to any construction of later ages. This level of effort challenges the assumption that hunter-gatherer groups of the 10th millennium BCE were simple or unsophisticated. The pillars reveal a society capable of planning, engineering, and mobilizing hundreds, perhaps thousands, toward a shared vision. They suggest leadership, cooperation, and a symbolic world powerful enough to compel such labor. Göbekli Tepe was not a settlement. It was not a place to live. These stones were raised for reasons beyond survival. What did the pillars mean? Some archaeologists argue that they depict gods, the first monumental representations of the divine in human history. Others see them as ancestors, remembered and exalted in stone. Still others suggest they embody cosmic guardians, standing between humanity and the forces of the unseen. Their abstract shape, a flat, featureless head upon a vertical body, may have been intentional, transcending individuality to represent something more universal. The anthropomorphic details reinforce this reading. The carved hands with their long, stylized fingers are always shown clasped at the navel as though in ritual repose. The belts and loincloths echo garments worn in later Neolithic imagery, symbols of status or sanctity. In some enclosures, animal reliefs adorn the pillars, merging human and beast into composite forms. Foxes slink across torsos, snakes coil along their flanks. The pillars may not have been seen as merely human, but as thresholds between categories. Part person, part spirit, part animal. Part cosmos, Enclosure D, the most elaborate, contains the largest of these pillars. Each central monolith stands more than 5 meters tall, dwarfing the surrounding stones. Their placement is deliberate, their axis aligned so that the pair faces one another. Between them lies an open space, perhaps the very heart of the sanctuary. Was this gap a passage, a doorway into another world? Was it where ceremonies unfolded, or offerings were placed, beneath the silent gaze of the twin figures? The geometry suggests intentionality, a blueprint of belief. Comparisons to later cultures are tempting, though speculative. Across Mesopotamia and Anatolia, standing figures presiding over ritual space became common in millennia that followed. Yet Göbekli Tepe predates them all by thousands of years. Here we see the germ of a tradition, monumentalized before writing, before pottery, before agriculture had fully taken hold. These T-shaped monoliths are among humanity's first attempts to embody the sacred in stone. The facelessness of the pillars is one of their most haunting qualities. Unlike later statues, they bear no eyes, no mouth, no expressions. They are not portraits of individuals, but presences stripped of personal identity. Perhaps this was intentional, an attempt to render the eternal rather than the ephemeral, the archetype rather than the ancestor. Some scholars argue the blank faces were meant to draw attention away from human likeness and toward the cosmic order they represented. Others suggest that the absence of features was itself a gesture of reverence, acknowledging that the divine could not be captured in recognizable form. At night, with firelight flickering against their surfaces, these pillars would have loomed as towering silhouettes. Their shadows would stretch across the enclosures, merging with the animal reliefs carved along their flanks. Imagine gatherings of people, torches casting light upon the carved hands and belts, chants echoing against the limestone. In such a setting, the pillars must have felt alive, more than stone, more than symbol, but embodiments of forces greater than the community that built them. And yet, questions remain unanswered. Why the T-shape? Why the abstraction, when the same carvers were capable of astonishing realism in animal reliefs? Was the T a symbolic form known across the region, now lost to us? Was it meant to represent a headless body, a being of power without human frailties? Or does it mark something entirely outside our categories, a sign of a worldview we can scarcely glimpse? The T-shaped pillars are scattered across multiple enclosures, each variation hinting at layers of meaning. Some carry animal reliefs, others are plain. Some face inward, others outward. The arrangement shifts from enclosure to enclosure, suggesting different functions, different gatherings, different stories carved into stone. Perhaps each circle represented a community, a lineage, or a myth. Perhaps the pillars served as intermediaries in rituals of death, transformation, or renewal. The evidence whispers, but never shouts. Even the act of burying the enclosures adds to the enigma. Each circle of pillars was eventually filled with rubble, deliberately entombed. Why would the builders conceal their own creations? Was it an act of closure, marking the end of a cycle? Or did new enclosures supplant the old, each generation building fresh circles as older ones were sealed beneath? The pillars, so carefully raised, were just as carefully buried, as though their presence remained powerful even after their use had ended. In these T-shaped forms, we glimpse the earliest architecture of the sacred. They are not houses for the living, but houses for presence, whether divine, ancestral, or cosmic. They are faceless, yet anthropomorphic, abstract yet deeply human. They stand as guardians of a symbolic universe that once stretched across the Harran Plain, a universe whose outlines we can trace but never fully reconstruct. The T-shaped pillars remain the most haunting riddle of Göbekli Tepe. They stand in silence, their meaning obscured by 12 millennia of forgetting. Are they gods? Are they the dead, raised in stone? Are they symbols of forces too vast for names? Whatever their purpose, they endure, mute yet eloquent, inviting us to stand beneath them and wonder. Beneath their weight, we are reminded that the builders of Göbekli Tepe were not primitive foragers fumbling towards civilization. They were visionaries, capable of carving eternity into limestone, of imagining presences that transcend the boundaries of life and death. The pillars, faceless and eternal, are fragments of a lost language, one still echoing across the windswept hilltop, waiting to be heard. Chapter 4. Animal reliefs and carvings carved into the limestone pillars of Göbekli Tepe are images that seem to shimmer with meaning, even after 12,000 years. Foxes slink across the stone as though in perpetual motion. Wild boars bristle with energy, their curved tusks sharply outlined. Serpents coil and twist in unsettling profusion, while scorpions crouch with raised stingers. Vultures spread their wings in stark silhouette, gazing outward from the pillars as if keeping watch. Lions, too, stride across the rock, powerful and untamed. These animals are not random decorations. They are emblems, signs, and echoes of a symbolic world that is both familiar and irretrievably strange. The artistry of these reliefs is striking. Carved with flint tools, every line is deliberate, every contour purposeful. The carvers understood the sinews of a fox, the curve of a vulture's wing, the coil of a serpent's body. They were hunters and observers, people whose survival depended on reading the movements and patterns of the natural world. And yet what they engraved into stone was not mere observation, it was interpretation. The animals of Göbekli Tepe are both natural and mythic, figures alive in memory, ritual, and story. The vulture appears with striking frequency, and its presence invites deep reflection. In Neolithic Jericho and Çatalhöyük, some centuries later, burial practices involved exposing the dead to carrion birds. Flesh was consumed, and only bones remained. This practice is sometimes called excarnation, the transformation of the body by nature's agents. The vulture, then, was not simply an animal, but a mediator, carrying the soul from the realm of the living to the world beyond. Its wings were bridges between earth and sky. The carvings at Göbekli Tepe may hint at a similar worldview, one in which death was not an end but a passage. Guided by the flight of birds, snakes too are everywhere, writhing along the shafts of pillars, slithering across the stone in groups, their heads raised in warning. To later cultures, serpents would symbolize renewal, danger, or hidden knowledge. At Göbekli Tepe, they may have been guardians, protecting the sanctity of the enclosures, or emblems of fear itself, etched into stone to confront and contain it. The scorpion, close cousin to the serpent in this symbolic bestiary, evokes the desert and its dangers, a reminder of mortality in a landscape both harsh and sacred. The foxes carved into the pillars are curious figures. They are slender, alert, and almost playful in their depiction. Archaeologists have noted that fox bones appear in the refuse around Göbekli Tepe, suggesting they held ritual significance. Some have proposed that foxes served as clan animals, totems of identity for groups gathering at the sanctuary. In later Near Eastern mythology, the fox appears as a trickster figure, a boundary crosser between worlds. At Göbekli Tepe, its meaning remains obscure, but its frequent appearance signals importance beyond the ordinary. Wild boars charge across some reliefs, tusks thrust outward in frozen aggression. To the hunter-gatherers of the early Neolithic, the boar was both prey and adversary, a dangerous creature demanding respect. Its presence on the pillars could symbolize strength, courage, or the struggles of the hunt. Perhaps it also marked the identity of those who gathered beneath its image, echoing traditions where animal emblems represented tribes, clans, or lineages. Then there are the lions, majestic, powerful, and rare in the local environment of the time. Their inclusion suggests something more than natural observation. The lion may have stood as a symbol of power, of domination, or of a spiritual force untamed by human order. To carve a lion upon a pillar was to invoke its strength, to anchor its presence within the sacred enclosure. The interpretation of these reliefs is a matter of ongoing debate. Some scholars argue that the animals reflect a mythological bestiary, a set of stories and beliefs in which animals served as intermediaries, guides, or spiritual forces. Others suggest the carvings may encode constellations, mapping the heavens onto stone. This theory points to the so-called Vulture Stone, a carved slab from Göbekli Tepe, showing a vulture, a scorpion, and other figures in a composition some believe corresponds to a star map of the sky around 10950 BCE. If true, it would suggest that Göbekli Tepe's builders tracked the heavens with precision, linking sky and earth in a single symbolic language. There is another, more grounded interpretation, that the reliefs catalogue the fauna of southeastern Anatolia, a record of the animals that shaped daily life. In this reading, the carvings were not constellations or totems, but reminders of the creatures with which people shared their world. Yet even this perspective acknowledges the symbolic dimension. Animals were not just prey or threat, but beings woven into myth, ritual, and identity. The act of carving itself carried meaning. To inscribe a vulture on a pillar was to call it into presence, to anchor its power in stone. The builders chose which animals to depict and where to place them. Some carvings appear low on the pillars, close to the ground, while others are elevated, gazing outward. The placement may have been intentional, each image part of a larger narrative inscribed into the architecture of the enclosures. In many cultures, animals serve as mediators between humans and the divine. They are seen as messengers, protectors, or embodiments of forces greater than themselves. The reliefs at Göbekli Tepe fit this universal pattern, though in a form unique to their time. Here, the boundaries between human, animal, and God blur. Some pillars even merge anthropomorphic and animal features, suggesting composite beings, guardians of thresholds between worlds. The sheer density of the carvings adds to the mystery. Over 200 reliefs have been documented, each executed with remarkable skill. This was no casual art. It was an intentional, sustained project requiring time, labor, and a shared symbolic language. The repetition of certain motifs, the vulture, the snake, the fox, suggests themes central to the builder's worldview. To stand in an enclosure surrounded by these carvings was to stand within a symbolic cosmos, a world of stone alive with presences. What we lack, of course, is the key. Without writing, the stories encoded in these images remain inaccessible. Were they tales of creation, myths of ancestors, warnings of danger, or star maps charting cosmic cycles? Did each clan bring its animal emblem, carving it into the stone to mark its place in the sacred circle? Or were these reliefs part of initiation rites, teaching stories passed down not through words, but through images illuminated by firelight and ritual? At night, flames would have flickered across the carved surfaces, bringing foxes to life, serpents to movement, vultures to flight. The enclosures would have been transformed into living mythscapes where stone dissolved into symbol. To those gathered there, the animals must have been more than images. They were presences, guides, and guardians. Even now, the reliefs resist our interpretations. They whisper of a worldview both close and distant, rooted in the natural world, yet suffused with meanings we can only guess at. The animals of Göbekli Tepe are frozen in stone, but in their silence they speak of a people who saw life, death, and cosmos reflected in every wingbeat, every claw, every coil of a serpent. Their meaning remains elusive, but their presence endures. Reminders that the first monumental sanctuary of humanity was a place alive with animals. With stories and with mysteries we are only beginning to glimpse. Chapter 5. Enclosure D. The oldest temple. Beneath the rolling soil of southeastern Turkey, where the dry winds sweep across limestone ridges, lies one of the most profound enigmas of the prehistoric world. Enclosure D at Göbekli Tepe, the largest and most elaborate of the site's circles, commands attention with its scale and its silence. Nearly 20 meters across, it opens like a stone amphitheater to the heavens, its form defined by colossal pillars carefully anchored into sockets hewn from bedrock. To step into its space, even reconstructed in the imagination, is to enter a chamber that feels both human and otherworldly. At the heart of Enclosure D stand two central monoliths, towering nearly 5.5 meters tall. Each weighs more than 15 tons. Unlike the smaller stones encircling them, these pillars are carved with unmistakable anthropomorphic details. Slender arms pressed along their shafts, hands clasping at the front, belts adorned with fox pelts or abstract motifs. They are not simple stones. They are beings, human-shaped, yet larger than human scale. Their silent stance dominates the enclosure, their presence heavy with mystery. Archaeologists who first uncovered these forms were confronted with a paradox. Here, in the depths of the pre-pottery Neolithic, some 6,000 years before the pyramids of Giza, hunter-gatherer communities raised what appears to be monumental sculpture, and not sculpture scattered at random, but a carefully designed architectural plan. A ring of smaller stones orbiting two monumental figures at its center. The deliberate symmetry, the monumental scale, and the anthropomorphic design suggest an intentionality that goes far beyond simple construction. Was Enclosure D a sanctuary? Some scholars cautiously describe it as the world's oldest known temple, an early expression of religious life etched into stone. Yet the term temple comes from later civilizations, with their pantheons, priests, and codified rituals. To project such categories backward across 12 millennia risks obscuring the unique world of Göbekli Tepe. And still, the impression of sacredness is undeniable. The carvings on the pillars lend further weight to this interpretation. Vultures spread their wings across the stone, recalling the sky-bound mediators of death and transformation. Foxes dart across belts and bases, their sinuous forms repeating motifs found elsewhere at the site. Abstract symbols, H-shapes, crescents, circles, cluster in deliberate arrangements, their meaning elusive yet purposeful. To those who carved them, these were not idle decorations, but signs woven into a greater pattern, one that we have only begun to sense. The very arrangement of the enclosure suggests more than utilitarian design. The central pillars face one another, as though in eternal dialogue, while the surrounding stones form a boundary encircling them. This spatial arrangement has led some to propose that the enclosure was a theatre of ritual, a place where ceremonies unfolded beneath the watch of these silent beings. The architecture itself becomes symbolic, a circular horizon of stone enclosing a central axis, perhaps a reflection of cosmological beliefs, earth below, sky above, and in between, the intermediaries carved into the rock. What kind of ceremonies might have been performed here? Without texts, answers remain in shadow, but clues lie in comparative traditions. Later, Neolithic sites such as Çatalhöyük suggest ritual gatherings where death and renewal were entwined. The presence of animal carvings, particularly vultures, recalls mortuary practices of excarnation, where the dead were exposed to carrion birds. Could Enclosure D have been a stage for rites of passage, where death was not hidden, but transformed in the presence of stone guardians? Others have looked upward, suggesting that Enclosure D may have served as a kind of observatory. Its alignment with the horizon allows unobstructed views of the rising and setting of celestial bodies. If the symbols carved into its stones indeed reference constellations, as some have proposed, then this circle may have been both sanctuary and star map, a place where the rhythms of the heavens were brought into correspondence with the rituals of earth. The two central pillars, facing one another, could have embodied dual principles: life and death, earth and sky, human and divine. Still others consider the enclosure through a social lens. The effort required to quarry, shape, transport, and erect these stones was immense. Hundreds of people would have been needed, working in coordination over months or years. This suggests that Enclosure D was not merely a local shrine, but a gathering point for scattered groups. It may have served as a unifying center, where clans and bands convened for ceremonies that reaffirmed their bonds, feasted in abundance, and honored the unseen powers they believed shaped their world. The anthropomorphic design of the central pillars is particularly striking. They are neither fully human nor entirely abstract. Their lack of faces suggests something beyond individual identity. Instead, they may represent archetypes, ancestors, deities, or guardians. Their belts and fox pelts echo later traditions where clothing and adornment symbolize status and role. Were these pillars embodiments of mythic ancestors, towering presences anchoring the community in story and ritual? Or were they more abstract, symbolic forms of cosmic principles too vast to be given human faces? The fox pelts carved into the belts are of special note. Foxes appear repeatedly across Göbekli Tepe's iconography, and their presence here on the most monumental pillars suggests a profound significance. In later cultures, foxes often symbolize liminality, the ability to move between worlds. To carve them upon the belts of these colossal beings may have been to mark them as threshold figures, guardians who could traverse the boundary between the human and the divine. Archaeologists have debated the chronological position of Enclosure D. It appears to be among the earliest of Göbekli Tepe's structures, yet also the most elaborate. This paradox suggests that the sanctuary began at its height, with its most ambitious vision realized first, followed by smaller and less imposing constructions. Was this decline intentional, reflecting shifts in belief, or does it indicate that the community's resources and unity gradually diminished over time? Enclosure D, then, becomes not only a centerpiece, but a marker of an apex, a moment when the builders reached for something vast before fading into smaller scales. The question of intent lingers. Why would hunter-gatherers with no settled agriculture invest such immense energy into a project like Enclosure D? Traditional theories of civilization suggest that monumental architecture emerges after surplus food, stable settlements, and hierarchies develop. Yet Göbekli Tepe inverts this sequence. Here, the monument comes first. Ritual and symbol may have driven social organization, not the other way around. Enclosure D becomes a challenge to the linear story of human history, a reminder that belief and imagination may have been the true catalysts of civilization. Standing before these pillars today, weathered and worn yet still imposing, one is struck by their presence. They command silence. They invite reflection. They seem to hold stories that refuse to be spoken. Were they guardians of a mythic past, protectors of sacred rites, or embodiments of forces now forgotten? Their meaning remains suspended in stone, waiting for us to listen, yet always eluding our grasp. Enclosure D is more than an architectural achievement. It is a statement, an assertion of belief, of community, of connection between worlds. It asks us to reconsider what it means to be human, to wonder whether the roots of our civilization lie not in fields of grain, but in circles of stone where imagination took form. And yet, even here, amidst the grandeur of Enclosure D, the questions multiply. Why was it eventually buried? What drove its builders to conceal the very monument that defined their efforts? Did they close it with reverence or with fear? The silence of the enclosure offers no answer, only the enduring presence of two stone beings, locked in their eternal vigil beneath the Anatolian sky. Chapter 6. Rituals of Death and Transformation. In the soil around Göbekli Tepe, scattered among the limestone fragments and animal bones, lie traces of something far more unsettling. Human remains, fragments of skulls, long bones and teeth, have emerged from the excavations. They are not arranged in graves, nor gently laid to rest as one might expect in a sanctuary of such grandeur. Instead, they appear as disarticulated pieces, sometimes bearing the marks of deliberate modification. For archaeologists, these bones are among the most enigmatic discoveries at the site, whispering of rituals where death was not hidden away, but integrated into the life of the community. Some of these bone fragments show cut marks, sharp incisions consistent with the removal of flesh. In modern forensic analysis, such patterns are clear indicators of defleshing, a process in which the soft tissue of the body was carefully stripped from bone. This raises the unsettling possibility that the dead at Göbekli Tepe were not buried in the earth but exposed to the elements, their flesh offered to the sky. The vultures carved so prominently into the pillars seem to echo this possibility. For many early cultures, these carrion birds were not symbols of decay, but mediators of transformation. They consumed the body and released the spirit, carrying it upward into the realm of the unseen. Excarnation rituals, where the dead were placed upon platforms or exposed on open ground, are attested across the ancient Near East. At Neolithic Jericho, plastered skulls with painted eyes suggest that the bones of the dead were not merely disposed of, but reintegrated into the living community. At Çatalhöyük, to the west, burials beneath house floors placed ancestors literally beneath the foundations of daily life. In each case, the body was not simply discarded. It was transformed, recycled into the symbolic fabric of the community and infused with continuing presence. Göbekli Tepe, however, offers something even more ambiguous. Unlike Jericho or Çatalhöyük, no burials have been found beneath the floors of its enclosures. No carefully curated skulls were discovered staring out with painted eyes. Instead, we find fragments, partial remains, dispersed in layers of fill, intermingled with animal bones. This scattering complicates interpretation. Were these the remains of ritual feasting, where human flesh may have been consumed in ceremonies we can scarcely imagine? Or were they the relics of secondary burial, the remnants left behind after the body had undergone transformation on some raised platform beneath the gaze of stone vultures? The imagery carved across the pillars reinforces the possibility of a symbolic link between the dead and the sacred space. Vultures appear repeatedly, sometimes shown hovering above headless human figures. Such images invite us to see Göbekli Tepe not only as a place of gathering, but as a liminal threshold, a stage upon which the boundaries between life and death, body and spirit, were negotiated. To the builders, death may not have been a final end, but a passage, a process requiring careful ritual intervention to ensure the soul's transition. The question remains: what role did the community play in these rites? Were the dead honored as ancestors, their remains reintegrated into communal ceremonies, or were certain individuals singled out for ritual treatment, shamans, leaders, or mythic figures whose bodies carried special potency? The lack of complete skeletons makes it difficult to answer, yet the very presence of modified human remains within such a monumental sanctuary suggests that Göbekli Tepe was more than a neutral gathering ground. It was a place where death itself was brought into the ritual sphere. One particularly striking discovery involves human skull fragments that appear to have been deliberately carved. Fine grooves etched into the bone suggest patterns that may have been decorative or symbolic. Were these skulls displayed, suspended as ritual objects within the enclosures? If so, then Göbekli Tepe's builders may have considered the human head a vessel of power, a seat of spirit capable of lingering long after death. Such practices resonate with traditions across the Levant, where skull veneration formed a cornerstone of Neolithic ritual, and yet ambiguity persists. Some scholars caution against interpreting every cut mark or modification as ritual. They point out that in a site used seasonally by large gatherings, human remains could have entered the archaeological record in ways that do not reflect sacred rites, through violence, accident, or even mundane disposal. Could the fragments found at Göbekli Tepe be remnants of conflict rather than ceremony? Were they the trophies of warfare, displayed as warnings or as tokens of victory? The evidence is too sparse, too fragmentary, to provide certainty. What is undeniable, however, is that death loomed large in the symbolic vocabulary of Göbekli Tepe. The vultures, the headless figures, the enigmatic symbols etched into stone, all point toward a worldview deeply preoccupied with the passage of life into death and death into something beyond. Whether as ancestor veneration, cosmic renewal, or a darker form of ritual, the treatment of the dead at Göbekli Tepe reveals that the builders did not separate the sacred from the mortal. To them, the body itself was raw material for transformation. Comparisons with other cultures help us sense the wider context. In the highlands of Tibet, even today, sky burials expose the dead to vultures, allowing the body to be carried into the heavens. In ancient Mesopotamia, offerings to the dead were essential to maintain cosmic balance. Across time and culture, the body has often been understood not as a final form, but as a vessel, its transformation essential to the continuation of life. Göbekli Tepe, standing at the dawn of civilization, may represent one of the earliest stages of this enduring dialogue between the living and the dead. The presence of feasting debris at the site complicates this further. Enormous quantities of animal bones, particularly gazelle and aurochs, suggest large-scale communal meals. Were these feasts part of funerary rites, celebrations in which the living gathered to honor the departed, or were they seasonal festivals in which human remains played only a peripheral or symbolic role? The lines blur, and in that blurring, we sense the difficulty of reconstructing the minds of those who lived 12,000 years ago. Perhaps the rituals of death at Göbekli Tepe were not meant to separate life from death, but to unify them. Perhaps the sanctuary was not only a place of cosmic renewal, but also of transformation, where human remains became part of the sacred cycle of stone, sky, and spirit. If so, then Göbekli Tepe was a stage not merely for the living to gather, but for the dead to participate in the eternal dialogue of existence. And yet, as with every corner of this site, questions remain suspended in silence. Were the fragments we find today the remains of honored ancestors, or the detritus of forgotten ceremonies? Did the vultures carved upon the pillars soar as symbols of release, or as reminders of mortality? The answers lie buried in stone and bone, their voices muted, their meanings concealed. All we can say is this: in the shadow of those towering pillars, the people of Göbekli Tepe confronted death with ritual, imagination, and a vision of transformation. But whether they saw death as a passage to the stars a reunion with ancestors, or a dissolution into the cycles of Earth remains a mystery. The sanctuary whispers of ceremonies now lost, of rituals where flesh, bone, and spirit were bound to cosmic forces. It leaves us with a haunting reflection. At Göbekli Tepe, death was not an ending, but a threshold. And what lay beyond that threshold is something we may never fully know. Chapter 7: Enclosure C and the Shifting Symbolism. When the excavators moved beyond the grandeur of Enclosure D, they encountered another circle, one that seemed at first to echo the same pattern, but on closer inspection revealed a different tone. This was Enclosure C. Still impressive in scale, measuring nearly 25 meters across, it nonetheless bore signs of change, both in its construction and in its symbolic vocabulary. Where Enclosure D had radiated monumentality, its towering, central pillars dominating the space with an almost cosmic authority, Enclosure C spoke more quietly, its stones less imposing, its carvings more severe, and its atmosphere markedly darker. The central pillars of Enclosure C, though still tall by any measure, do not match the height or refinement of their predecessors. Standing just over 4 meters, they appear somewhat reduced in ambition. The anthropomorphic details, the arms, the hands, the belts, that gave Enclosure D's pillars a distinctly human character, are either absent or less pronounced here. Instead, the surfaces of the stones are dominated by writhing serpents, prowling wild animals, and abstract motifs whose meanings remain elusive. To step into Enclosure C, even in its ruined state, is to feel a shift in mood. From the ordered grandeur of D to something more foreboding, more unsettled. Archaeologists have long debated the meaning of this transition. Was Enclosure C the product of the same community that raised D, built at a slightly later time as part of a continuing cycle of construction? Or does it represent the work of a different group, a community with its own symbolic system, laying claim to the hill and its sacred stones? Radiocarbon dating suggests that C and D were broadly contemporaneous, belonging to the same pre-pottery Neolithic A horizon, around 9600 to 9400 BCE. Yet within that narrow span of centuries, subtle cultural shifts may have unfolded, visible in the stones themselves. The imagery of serpents is particularly striking. Snakes appear across several enclosures at Göbekli Tepe, but in Enclosure C, they seem to dominate the iconography. Long, sinuous forms slither across the pillars, sometimes accompanied by scorpions or other creatures associated with danger and liminality. In many cultures, snakes carry layered meanings. They are symbols of fertility, guardians of thresholds, embodiments of chaos, or messengers between worlds. At Göbekli Tepe, their prevalence raises questions. Were they protective spirits, warding off malign forces during ceremonies? Or did they embody the very forces of death and transformation that the community sought to confront? The wild animals. Carved here, boars, foxes, and predators also intensify the atmosphere. Where Enclosure D had conveyed a sense of order, with twin central pillars facing each other in silent dialogue, Enclosure C feels more turbulent, more alive with the unpredictability of the natural world. Some scholars have suggested that this shift marks a change in ritual focus. Perhaps Enclosure D was associated with ancestors, cosmic order, and the mediation of human presence in the world, while Enclosure C was oriented toward raw forces of nature, danger, and the testing of the human spirit. The reduced scale of the central pillars has also been interpreted in different ways. One line of thought suggests that the builders of C had fewer resources at their disposal, or less social cohesion, and could no longer marshal the labor required for stones of D's magnitude. Another proposes that the smaller pillars were intentional, that the community no longer sought sheer monumentality, but instead shifted toward different symbolic priorities. The choice may not represent decline at all, but evolution. When viewed together, D and C may represent not continuity, but transformation. They are not identical copies of one another, but chapters in a longer unfolding story. Each enclosure at Göbekli Tepe, in fact, seems to bear its own character, its own balance of imagery, its own subtle differences in scale and construction. The site was not built all at once, like a city rising under a single plan, but over centuries, with each generation adding, altering, and burying the works of its predecessors. That act of deliberate burial is key. Like Enclosure D, Enclosure C was eventually entombed beneath layers of backfill, stone, and soil. This was not the slow erosion of time, but a purposeful act. The builders filled in their own monument, as if closing a chapter. Why? Did their beliefs shift so radically that they felt compelled to bury the symbols of an earlier era? Or was burial itself part of the ritual cycle, a way of sealing the sacred space once its purpose had been fulfilled? The stones, locked away for millennia, seem to carry the silence of an intentional forgetting. The contrast between Enclosures D and C highlights another mystery. Was Göbekli Tepe the work of a single community evolving through time, or a sacred hill shared by multiple groups, each imprinting their own worldview upon its summit? Archaeologists have found subtle variations in construction techniques and symbolic motifs that could point toward different communities. Yet the continuity of the T-shaped pillars and the recurring animal imagery suggests a shared symbolic language. Perhaps the sanctuary was a meeting ground, a neutral stage where diverse groups gathered, each contributing their own circle of stones, their own layer of meaning. In this light, Enclosure C takes on an added dimension. Its serpents and wild animals may reflect the identity of one group within a broader cultural mosaic. The smaller scale of its central pillars may not signal weakness, but difference. A distinct cosmology expressed in stone, existing alongside the towering human-like forms of D. The Hilltop Sanctuary may have been a place where many worldviews converged, sometimes harmonizing, sometimes clashing, each leaving traces in limestone. To walk among the ruins of Enclosure C today is to sense both continuity and divergence. The arrangement is familiar: twin central pillars, a surrounding ring of smaller stones, carvings etched into the surfaces. Yet the feeling is unmistakably altered. Where D stands as a monument to human-like figures in cosmic dialogue, C whispers of serpents, scorpions, and shadows, as though the sanctuary had turned inward, toward the darker forces of the unseen world. The stones do not resolve these questions, they only deepen them. Was Enclosure C an echo of its predecessor, a reduced version shaped by necessity? Or was it a deliberate departure, a new chapter in the sacred story of the hill? Did the people of Göbekli Tepe view their enclosures as replacements, each one surpassing the last? Or as parallel worlds, each holding a different key to the mysteries of life and death? In the silence of the plateau, Enclosure C endures as both a mirror and a shadow of Enclosure D. Together, they remind us that even at the dawn of civilization, human beliefs were not fixed but shifting, layered and contested. Each circle of stone may hold a different fragment of a cosmology too vast for us to reconstruct. Each may testify to a community negotiating its place in a changing world. And so we are left with a lingering thought. Beneath the writhing serpents and restless animals of Enclosure C, what transformation was being enacted? Was it fear that drove these carvings, or reverence? Was it decline, or renewal? The answers lie buried within the hill, still locked in stone, waiting for voices that can no longer speak. Chapter 8. The Quarry and the Moving of Stone. On the limestone slopes surrounding Göbekli Tepe, traces of immense labour remain etched into the bedrock. Here, not far from the enclosures themselves, lie the quarries from which the monoliths were born. At first glance, these cuttings in the earth appear unremarkable, jagged scars and shallow trenches across the plateau. But when one looks closer, the shapes of pillars emerge, massive T-forms still attached to the bedrock, some nearly complete, others abandoned mid-process. They are like frozen moments in time, silent evidence of the immense human effort that once rang out across this hill. The largest of these unfinished pillars stretches over 7 meters in length, dwarfing the stones that now stand upright in the sanctuaries. It weighs perhaps 50 tons, far beyond what we see erected in the enclosures. Why was it left behind? Was it too large to move? Did cracks appear during carving, rendering it unstable? Or was the project intentionally abandoned? A reminder that not all ambitions could be realized in stone. The quarries tell us that the builders of Göbekli Tepe were not improvising. They had a clear method, a set of techniques for extracting, shaping, and transporting pillars of extraordinary size, working with stone tools made of flint. They chipped carefully around the outlines of each monolith, cutting trenches to free its sides. Then, with persistence and patience, they undercut the base, severing the connection between pillar and earth. The process would have taken weeks, perhaps months, for each stone. But quarrying was only the beginning. Once freed, the blocks, some weighing as much as 20 tons, had to be moved across uneven ground to the summit of the hill. Without wheels, metal, or beasts of burden, how was this possible? Archaeologists suggest that levers and wooden sledges were employed. The stones dragged or rolled along prepared tracks of logs. Teams of workers, perhaps hundreds at a time, would have coordinated their movements, heaving together with ropes woven from plant fibers or animal hides. The very act required not just strength, but rhythm, an orchestration of bodies and voices moving as one. It is here that the mystery deepens. To quarry, transport, and erect such stones demanded more than raw labor. It required a system of organization, planning, and above all, motivation. The people of Göbekli Tepe were hunter-gatherers, living before the rise of permanent villages or formal hierarchies, at least as traditionally understood. Yet the scale of the sanctuary implies bonds strong enough to mobilize extraordinary effort. What force brought them together on this windswept hill? One possibility is devotion. Perhaps the stones were raised by communities united through shared belief, compelled not by coercion, but by reverence. Seasonal gatherings may have drawn groups from across the surrounding plains, converging for rituals, feasting, and the collective labor of construction. The building itself could have been part of the ceremony, a sacred act that transformed toil into offering. Others see the possibility of leadership, of ritual specialists or early elites who directed the work. The ability to envision, plan, and command such projects hints at figures with unusual influence. Were they shamans, myth keepers, or the first stirrings of priestly authority? If so, the stones themselves may stand as monuments not just to gods, but to the power of those who spoke for them. Yet there is another way to see it. The sheer physicality of the work may have been its own purpose. The labor bound people together, weaving social ties through shared struggle. Each stone moved, each pillar raised, was not only a symbol of devotion, but a living memory of cooperation. In this view, the sanctuary was as much about community as cosmology. A place where the hard labor of many forged a bond that no single band of foragers could sustain alone. Still, the logistics remain staggering. To move a 20-ton stone even a short distance requires coordination on a scale difficult to imagine. Experimental archaeology has shown that teams of 50 to 100 people, using ropes and wooden sledges, can move stones of similar weight. But Göbekli Tepe's builders may have mobilized far greater numbers, especially during seasonal gatherings when the population swelled. Were these migrations tied to the movements of animals, to the ripening of wild grains, to celestial cycles that mark the calendar of the sky? We cannot know. But the quarry and the sanctuary speak of rhythms both earthly and cosmic. Once transported, the pillars had to be raised. This may have been the most difficult task of all. Imagine a trench dug into the bedrock, sockets carefully prepared to receive the base of the monolith. The stone, lying prone, would be maneuvered into position, its base lowered into the socket. Then, through a combination of ropes, levers, and sheer human force, the great pillar was heaved upright, inch by inch, until it stood firm against the pull of gravity. The moment of its raising must have been a sight of awe. Hundreds of voices shouting in unison, the creak of wood, the strain of rope, and then the silence as the pillar locked into place, a new presence on the hill, enduring as though it had always stood there. The quarries offer glimpses of this story, but not its full telling. Abandoned pillars lie as though frozen in anticipation, never raised, never carved with images. They remind us that for every stone that stands, there were others left behind, their labor unfinished. Perhaps each generation left its own marks in the quarries, shaping and discarding, succeeding and failing in a cycle that stretched across centuries. The stones themselves hold no answers to the human cost. How many lives were shaped by this labor? How many injuries, how many songs, how many generations carried the memory of the stones they had moved? We can only imagine, but what is clear is that Göbekli Tepe could not have risen without bonds stronger than necessity. These were people who gave more than survival required. They gave themselves to something larger, something enduring, something they believed worth carving into stone. And so the quarries remain, silent witnesses to that devotion. They lie just beyond the enclosures, open to the sky, their unfinished pillars still tethered to the earth. They speak not only of stone, but of the will to lift stone against gravity, to carve meaning into permanence. The question lingers still. What vision was powerful enough to move such weight, to marshal such labor, to bring so many hands to a single purpose on a lonely hill? The quarries do not answer. They only echo, their silence heavy with the memory of chisels, ropes, and the straining breath of countless workers. And as the sun sets over the limestone plateau, one cannot help but wonder, were the stones moved by human hands alone, or by the gravity of belief itself? Chapter 9. Backfilling the enclosures. When the spades of modern archaeologists first cut into the hill of Göbekli Tepe, they did not find temples standing proud in the open air. They found them entombed. The great circles of stone, those towering T-shaped pillars carved and raised with such devotion, were buried beneath tons of earth, rubble, and refuse. They had not collapsed, nor had they simply eroded away with the passing of millennia. They had been deliberately sealed. The act was methodical. The voids between pillars were packed with broken limestone, animal bones, and shards of flint tools. Layer upon layer filled the enclosures until no space remained. What once stood as open-air sanctuaries had become subterranean memories, invisible to the sun, preserved only by the very burial that concealed them. It is this paradox that gives Göbekli Tepe its haunting character. Had the site not been buried, it might never have survived the ages. And yet, we must ask, why would its builders cover their sacred creations in the first place? Archaeologists describe the process as backfilling, but the term cannot capture the strangeness of the act. This was no casual dumping of debris. It was deliberate, organized, perhaps ceremonial. In the fill, excavators discovered not just random rubble, but carefully layered deposits. There were the bones of gazelle and aurochs, of wild boar and birds. There were flint tools broken and discarded, fragments of daily life woven into the grave of a sanctuary. The impression is less of abandonment and more of ritual closure. Some scholars speak of a symbolic killing of the enclosures, a way of retiring their power once their role was complete. In this interpretation, each sanctuary lived a life of its own, perhaps spanning generations, before being sealed with solemn intent. The stones were not destroyed but entombed, as if to lay a body to rest, just as ancestors might be buried beneath houses in places like Çatalhöyük. Here entire monuments were given burial, with offerings of bones and tools serving as funerary goods. Yet the reasons remain elusive. Was the burial an act of reverence, sealing the sanctuaries so that their spirits would not fade? Or was it an act of suppression, silencing something that had become too powerful, too dangerous to remain exposed? We can only speculate. The earth that preserved Göbekli Tepe so perfectly also conceals the intentions of those who laid it down. One hypothesis suggests that each new generation of builders raised fresh enclosures nearby, backfilling the older ones to make way for the new. In this view, the hilltop became a palimpsest, its sanctuaries layered one atop another, each circle superseding the last. Excavations show that some enclosures overlap in sequence, suggesting that this was indeed a place of continual renewal. But even so, the act of burial feels too purposeful, too ritualized, to be explained by pragmatism alone. Others have wondered whether protection was the goal. By the time of backfilling, perhaps enemies threatened the sanctuary, or environmental change made the site less accessible. Covering the stones would have shielded them from destruction, preserving their sanctity until a distant future. If so, the backfilling could be read as a message across time. Not destruction, but preservation, a deliberate entombment to safeguard memory. But if that was the intent, who was meant to rediscover them thousands of years later? Surely not us. The material within the fill raises further questions. Many of the animal bones show cut marks, evidence of feasting. Were these remains part of ritual banquets, celebratory gatherings tied to the burial of a sanctuary? Imagine hundreds gathered on the hill, their fires glowing, their voices rising in song as they consumed animals hunted from the plains. When the feasting was done, The bones were cast into the enclosures, layer upon layer, mingling with stone chips and broken tools. The monuments became vessels, filled not with emptiness, but with the remnants of human presence. And still another possibility lingers, that secrecy itself was the aim. By burying their sanctuaries, the builders may have sought to conceal knowledge, to withdraw it from the realm of the living. What truths were carved on those pillars? Truths too dangerous, perhaps, to remain in the open. In later civilizations, we find echoes of this impulse. Sacred texts hidden in caves, relics sealed in tombs, monuments aligned to celestial cycles, and then buried when their time had passed. Göbekli Tepe may represent the earliest whisper of this same instinct, to guard mysteries by hiding them away. The deliberate burial also changes how we see time at the site. We often imagine these enclosures as eternal structures, meant to endure for millennia. But perhaps to their builders, permanence was never the goal. Perhaps the sanctuaries were always temporary, living stages for ritual that were destined to be closed, their meaning carried forward only in memory and in new constructions. In this rhythm of building and burial, of revelation and concealment, Göbekli Tepe begins to feel less like a frozen monument and more like a heartbeat, pulsing with cycles of creation and closure. What, then, of those who performed the final act of burial? Did they do so in silence, carrying stones and bones into the circles until they vanished beneath the earth? Or was it accompanied by chants, by ritual, by a sense of solemn farewell? Did they believe they were sealing away gods, or ancestors, or mythic guardians whose time had come to rest? We do not know, but the stones themselves bear witness. They stand today because they were buried. Every carving, every relief survived the winds of 12,000 years because of the soil packed carefully around them. The very act that concealed them also protected them, like seeds lying dormant until the day of rediscovery. And so we are left with a haunting paradox. The burial of Göbekli Tepe was both an ending and a preservation, both concealment and revelation. Its meaning remains beyond our grasp, suspended between reverence and abandonment, secrecy and survival. We walk among the exposed pillars today only because of that ancient decision, a decision whose reasons may never be known. As the dust of excavation settles and the stones breathe once more beneath the open sky, we are left to wonder, did the builders intend for their sanctuaries to rise again in the distant future? Or did they mean for them to remain hidden forever, their voices silent beneath the earth? The answer lies somewhere between silence and stone, between memory and forgetting, waiting for us to listen. Chapter 10. Tools of the Builders. Beneath the shadows of Göbekli Tepe's towering pillars, archaeologists uncovered not golden relics, nor bronze chisels, nor the remnants of advanced machinery. Instead, scattered in the soil and packed within the backfill, they found simple shards of flint. Thousands of them, blades, scrapers, and chisels chipped from common stone. Fragile, almost unremarkable to the eye, these were the tools with which the greatest monument of the early Neolithic was built. The sheer contrast between tool and achievement is staggering. With no metal, no wheels, no beasts of burden to haul their loads, the builders of Göbekli Tepe relied entirely on the sharp edges of flint, the strength of their own hands, and the coordination of collective effort. To us, the mismatch appears almost impossible. How could such delicate implements carve, shape, and raise limestone monoliths weighing up to 20 tons? Yet the evidence lies in the soil itself. Every stage of the sanctuary's creation bears the imprint of stone upon stone. Archaeologists describe the flint tools as part of the wider Neolithic toolkit, a world where every cutting edge had to be coaxed from the earth by knapping, by striking nodules of flint or chert until razor-sharp flakes split away. The edges dulled quickly, but they could be renewed, reshaped, discarded, and remade. Excavations at Göbekli Tepe have uncovered an astonishing density of such fragments, suggesting not occasional activity, but sustained, large-scale labor. Some tools even bear microscopic traces of wear consistent with working limestone, fine scratches and polish left behind by hours of contact with stone surfaces. Through these modest implements, the great pillars took form. Flint chisels tapped at limestone blocks, scoring grooves, releasing shapes from the quarry floor. Scrapers smoothed surfaces, preparing them for the intricate carvings of foxes, vultures, and serpents. Blades shaped sockets in the bedrock, so that each monolith could stand upright in its foundation. Every animal relief that stares back at us today was born from this slow and patient craft. And yet, the scale of activity implied is extraordinary. To carve just one of the central pillars of Enclosure D, over 5 meters tall, weighing perhaps 15 tons, would have required thousands of hours of work. The surrounding ring of smaller stones, each decorated, would have demanded as much again. Multiply this effort across multiple enclosures and across centuries of construction, and one begins to glimpse the staggering devotion of labor involved. Each broken flake of flint is not simply a tool, but a fragment of time, a moment of human effort crystallized in stone. The volume of tools also hints at organization. While hunter-gatherer societies are often imagined as loosely structured bands, the archaeological record at Göbekli Tepe suggests a division of labor far more complex. Some individuals may have specialized in quarrying, others in carving, others in shaping or transporting the blocks. The thousands of discarded tools speak of craft knowledge passed from hand to hand, of skills taught, remembered, and perfected. This was not the work of amateurs improvising in the dust, but of a community that had learned how to translate stone into meaning. Still, the paradox remains. How could such primitive tools achieve such monumental results? This question has led some to wonder whether we are underestimating the ingenuity of Neolithic engineering. The builders knew their materials intimately. Limestone, though heavy, is relatively soft compared to granite. A flint edge, fresh from the knapper's hand, can bite into it with surprising efficiency. The absence of metal was no hindrance to minds that understood leverage, friction, and the rhythm of patient craft. The tools also reveal something of the rituals of construction themselves. Many appear to have been discarded not after breaking, but in deliberate abandonment. Were they offerings, left behind when a stage of work was complete? Or were they simply used up, their edges blunted by effort, their purpose fulfilled? The line between tool and symbol, between function and ritual, is blurred at Göbekli Tepe, just as the line between sanctuary and society blurs in the stone circles themselves. It is striking, too, that no evidence of wheeled transport or draft animals has been found. Every stone, every tool was moved and wielded by human strength alone. The image that emerges is of a community bound together by purpose, perhaps gathering seasonally in great numbers, pooling their energy in moments of intense labor before dispersing again across the fertile plains. The discarded tools are the echoes of those gatherings, voices of effort left in the soil. And yet, for all we have learned, the tools leave us with haunting silences. We can imagine the rhythm of napping flint, the sound of stone striking stone. We can picture the sparks of light as sharp edges split away, the calloused hands that gripped them, the sweat that darkened the earth beneath the quarry. But we cannot hear the words spoken between the workers, or the songs they might have sung as they raised each monolith. The tools are mute, their edges dulled by time. Yet they whisper of lives dedicated to a task beyond mere survival. The paradox remains at the heart of Göbekli Tepe, monumental visions born from the simplest of means. No metals, no wheels, no beasts of burden, only flint, limestone, and will. Each tiny blade, each broken scraper, reminds us that the divide we imagine between primitive and advanced is perhaps a false one. For here, with only stone in their hands, the builders inscribed their vision of the cosmos into the earth. And so, the thousands of flint tools scattered across the site are more than archaeological debris. They are the fingerprints of a vanished world. They are the bridge between human fragility and monumental permanence. They remind us that the sanctuary on the hill was not conjured into being by mystery alone, but by countless acts of craftsmanship, each small and fleeting, yet together forming a legacy that endures 12,000 years later. As the archaeologists sift through the soil, pulling flake after flake from the dust, one question lingers. How much of the builder's knowledge is lost to us? Did these tools carry meanings we cannot see, rituals we cannot name, techniques we cannot reconstruct? Perhaps the tools were more than instruments of labor. Perhaps they too were sacred, part of the ceremony of creation itself. We are left, as always, in the tension between what the stones reveal and what they conceal. Göbekli Tepe was built with the humblest of tools, yet it reshaped the trajectory of human history. The blades that once chipped away at limestone now lie silent, their edges dulled, their work complete, and still they whisper, faintly, of the hands that held them, and of the vision those hands served. Chapter 11. Feasting at the hilltop high on the limestone ridge where Göbekli Tepe rises, archaeologists uncovered not only the solemnity of carved stone, but also the traces of fire, bone, and vessel, scattered through the backfill, concentrated near enclosures, and preserved in layers of ash and soil, lie the remains of countless animals, horns, hooves, and splintered bones, mute testimony to gatherings where food was prepared and consumed in astonishing quantities. The scale of these remains is striking. Gazelle bones dominate the assemblage, a species once abundant in the plains below. Alongside them appear the remains of wild cattle, boar, sheep, goat, and birds. In some deposits, thousands of bones were recovered, many bearing cut marks where flesh was stripped, others cracked open to release their marrow. This was no quiet subsistence. It was communal feasting on a scale that far exceeded the needs of a small band of hunter-gatherers. The very landscape seems to confirm this interpretation. Large cooking pits have been identified, their stone linings blackened by fire. Some of these features are vast, suitable for roasting entire animals. Around them, archaeologists discovered heavy limestone basins, stone vessels hollowed from single blocks. Many measure more than half a meter across, their interiors polished by use. These could have held water or perhaps fermented beverages, brewed from early grains gathered in the hills. Together, the evidence points to gatherings of dozens, perhaps hundreds, assembled for ritual meals upon the hilltop. The notion of feasting at Göbekli Tepe is more than culinary. It is political, social, and spiritual. In early societies, large-scale meals carried profound significance. They bound communities together through shared consumption, reinforced alliances between groups, and created obligations of reciprocity. To feed another was not only generosity, it was a declaration of status, of belonging, of power. On the ridge above the Harran Plain, meat was not merely sustenance, it was a medium of meaning. Some scholars have suggested that these feasts were seasonal, aligned with the rhythms of migration and harvest. Gazelle herds, for instance, move through the region in predictable patterns. The builders of Göbekli Tepe may have timed their gatherings to coincide with these migrations, ensuring a bounty of meat to sustain large crowds. The hilltop sanctuary, then, would not have been a permanent settlement, but a focal point for episodic convergence, a place where scattered groups met, shared food, renewed bonds, and participated in rituals beneath the gaze of the carved pillars. Others proposed that the feasts marked rites of passage. The consumption of meat may have accompanied initiation ceremonies, the dedication of new enclosures, or funerary rites for the dead. In such contexts, eating together was not merely practical but symbolic, an act of transformation in which food became the medium through which communities engaged with the divine. The carcasses left behind are therefore more than refuse. They are the echoes of ceremonies where flesh and spirit, nourishment and symbolism were intertwined. The preparation of such meals required coordination on a remarkable scale. Hunting parties must have ranged across the plains, driving gazelles into enclosures or felling them with flint-tipped projectiles. The butchery of carcasses, the roasting of meat, the brewing of drink, the carving of bones, all demanded skill, time, and labor. Just as the construction of the stone enclosures reveals collective effort, so too do the remains of feasting reflect a community capable of organizing itself around shared purpose. The sanctuary was not only a place of carving and building, but of cooking, eating, and celebrating. What role, then, did these feasts play in the broader life of the community? Some archaeologists see them as crucial to the very existence of the monument. The labor required to quarry, shape, and erect the stones could not have been sustained by small family groups alone. Feasting may have provided both the motivation and the reward for such labor. Workers, drawn from dispersed bands, could have been sustained by the promise of abundant meat and drink. In this sense, feasting was not peripheral but central, the social glue that enabled construction itself. Yet, as with all at Göbekli Tepe, ambiguity remains. Were these meals joyous celebrations or solemn obligations? Did they unite communities in harmony or reinforce hierarchies of status and power? Was the sharing of food equal, or did some receive choice portions while others subsisted on scraps? The bones reveal only that animals were killed, butchered, and consumed. They cannot tell us how the meat was distributed or what emotions accompanied the meals. Hints of ritual linger in the details. Some bones appear deliberately placed, rather than discarded at random. Horns of wild cattle have been found arranged near enclosures, perhaps as offerings. Vulture imagery carved in stone may recall the scattering of bones in open feasts, where the division between human and animal consumption blurred. And the sheer abundance of remains suggests that these gatherings were never merely practical. They were occasions charged with meaning, feasts where the community engaged not only with one another, but with the unseen world. The memory of such rituals echoes in later traditions. Across the Fertile Crescent, in the millennia that followed, communal meals would remain central to religious and social life. From the sacrificial banquets of Mesopotamia to the funerary feasts of Anatolia, the act of eating together carried the weight of the sacred. Göbekli Tepe might stand at the dawn of this tradition, where the first monumental sanctuaries rose alongside the first monumental meals. The stones themselves, silent witnesses to these gatherings, still bear the marks of human touch. Reliefs of animals carved into their surfaces may not only represent totemic beings, but also the very creatures consumed in ritual feasts. Gazelles and boars etched into limestone pillars mirror the bones found in the soil, blurring the line between symbol and sustenance. The animals were both hunted and venerated, both eaten and immortalized. In feeding upon them, the community may have believed they partook in a cycle of life, death, and renewal. And so, amid the monumental enclosures, amid the solemn carvings and silent pillars, Göbekli Tepe was also a place of fire and laughter, of smoke rising into the night sky, of voices mingling over shared meals. Its mystery lies not only in the stone, but in the bones, remnants of feasts that bound people together, sustained their efforts, and carried meanings now half lost to time. The bones whisper of abundance, of ritual, of community, but they leave us with questions unanswered. Did these gatherings celebrate life, honor the dead, or mark the cycles of the cosmos? Were they moments of unity or of hierarchy? The truth is buried within the soil of the hilltop, scattered among the stones waiting in silence, and so, beneath the shadow of the towering pillars, the echoes of feasts remain. Reminders that this sanctuary was not built by stone alone, but by flesh, fire, and the bonds of human gathering. Chapter 12. The question of settlement. When archaeologists first uncovered the circles of Göbekli Tepe, they expected to find the familiar signs of a Neolithic village. Where there are monuments, surely there must also be homes. Where there are carvings, there must also be hearths, refuse heaps, and the traces of daily existence. Yet, as excavation expanded across the windswept plateau, what emerged was an absence more striking than any artifact. There were no house foundations, no ovens, no clay floors worn smooth by domestic life. The soil yielded no clusters of storage pits, no children's toys, no tools dulled by household use. Instead, what stood upon the hill was architecture without habitation, a sanctuary without settlement. This absence unsettled assumptions deeply ingrained in archaeology. For decades, the prevailing model suggested that monumental architecture could only arise after the stability of farming villages. Agriculture, it was thought, provided the surplus to support specialists, the organization to mobilize labor, and the permanence to anchor stone into earth. Göbekli Tepe defies this neat sequence. If built by hunter-gatherers, mobile, seasonal, and dispersed, it suggests that the impulse to build sacred places preceded the security of permanent homes. Here, it appears that belief, not bread, called forth the first monuments. Still, questions remain. Perhaps the settlement existed nearby, its remains yet to be found beneath later layers of soil. Surveyors have identified smaller sites within the region: Karahan Tepe, Sefer Tepe, Hamzan Tepe, where similar T-shaped pillars lie buried. Could these represent satellite villages, seasonal camps where builders lived while raising Göbekli Tepe's enclosures? Or did the sanctuary truly stand alone, isolated in the landscape, visited only during certain times of year when scattered groups converged to feast, build, and perform rites beneath the pillars? The evidence tilts toward the latter. The absence of trash layers is telling. Permanent villages generate enormous quantities of waste: broken pottery, ash, discarded tools, and food refuse. Over centuries, these accumulate into dense archaeological deposits. At Göbekli Tepe, such deposits are missing. Instead, the fill between enclosures consists of rubble deliberately placed, a backfill of stone and debris meant to bury and preserve. The soil does not tell the story of daily life, but of ritual closure. The builders came, they gathered, they carved and feasted, and then they departed. What might this mean for our understanding of the site? Some archaeologists propose that Göbekli Tepe served as a pilgrimage center, a focal point for multiple groups across the wider region. The stone pillars, with their carvings of animals and abstract symbols, may have carried meanings understood across cultural boundaries. The feasts, sustained by herds of gazelle and the sharing of grain-based drink, could have bound diverse groups into alliances, marriages, or ritual obligations. In this reading, the hilltop was not home, but crossroads, a sacred meeting place where society itself was reforged through stone and ceremony. Others interpret the absence differently. Perhaps the site was deliberately kept pure, free from the clutter of domestic life. By excluding homes, the builders created a separation between the sacred and the mundane. The enclosures, rising in silent circles, were reserved for ceremonies too powerful to be mingled with ordinary existence. Just as later temples across the world would be isolated from villages by walls, gates, or precincts, so too may Göbekli Tepe have been kept apart, its very emptiness signaling its holiness. There is also the possibility that the sanctuary embodied both functions. Seasonal camps may have sprung up on the slopes below the mound, ephemeral dwellings of wood and reed that left little archaeological trace. Fires may have burned, children may have played, and stories may have been told in temporary shelters, now erased by erosion and time. When the season ended, the people dispersed, leaving the stone circles behind until the next gathering. In this way, the settlement was not absent but transient, woven into the rhythms of migration, hunting, and ritual. The broader context of the region offers parallels. At Jerf el Ahmar on the Euphrates, structures from the same era show communal buildings standing apart from houses, places for meetings, storage, or ritual. At Chayonu, special buildings hint at collective activity distinct from daily life. These suggest a world in which early societies carved out spaces of the sacred alongside spaces of the ordinary. Göbekli Tepe may represent the most monumental expression of this pattern, an entire hill consecrated as communal ground, while habitation remained elsewhere. The question of settlement also touches upon the motivations of its builders. If they were not farmers, if they did not dwell permanently in villages, then what drove them to pour such energy into stone? Some argue that the sanctuary itself may have catalyzed domestication. In order to gather in such numbers, food supplies had to be abundant. The need to feed workers and visitors could have encouraged the tending of wild wheat, the management of herds, the first steps toward agriculture. In this provocative view, it was not farming that made ritual possible, but ritual that made farming necessary. Yet the silence of the mound resists final answers. No tools of farming have been found, no grinding stones in sufficient number to suggest permanent food processing. The absence lingers, like a pause in the archaeological record, a space where speculation fills the void. Perhaps the builders were hunters, drawn to the gazelle herds that course through the plains. Perhaps they were foragers, gathering wild barley and einkorn. Or perhaps they were already something in between, standing at the threshold of settled life, experimenting with permanence in stone even as their own lives remained fluid and mobile. The absence of houses, then, becomes not a deficit but a message. It tells us that Göbekli Tepe was never meant to be ordinary. Its stones were raised not for comfort but for ceremony, not for survival, but for something deeper: belief, community, memory. The people who gathered here left little trace of their daily lives, but they left enduring marks of their vision. They did not build homes, they built a sanctuary. And so, the hilltop stands as both presence and absence. Presence of stone, absence of settlement, presence of ritual, absence of routine. It leaves us to wonder whether Göbekli Tepe was less a place to live, and more a place to return to, again and again, across seasons and generations. In the silence between its enclosures, in the soil unmarked by hearths and houses, we find not emptiness but mystery, a deliberate separation, a chosen absence, one that whispers of a worldview in which the sacred demanded its own ground. And as the wind moves over the barren ridge, carrying with it the memory of those who gathered, feasted, and departed, the question remains: was Göbekli Tepe ever meant to be home, or was it always meant to be apart, standing alone as a beacon of the sacred in a world still finding its shape? Chapter 13. The Fertile Crescent. Connection Göbekli Tepe does not stand in isolation. It rises from the very heart of the Fertile Crescent, a sweep of valleys and slopes often called the cradle of civilization. This arc of land, stretching from the Levant through Upper Mesopotamia, nurtured some of humanity's first great transformations. Within its soils, wild einkorn wheat and barley grew thick, their seeds easily harvested. Its hills carried herds of wild sheep, goats, and cattle. Its rivers and seasonal streams sustained communities of foragers long before agriculture was named, and it was here, around 9600 BCE, that humans first began reshaping nature itself, coaxing plants and animals into domestication. The sanctuary at Göbekli Tepe sits precisely within this landscape of change. Its builders carved pillars of limestone, at the very moment when humans were crossing a threshold between old ways and new. Archaeologists have long debated whether the Hilltop was born from this agricultural shift, or whether, astonishingly, it helped bring that shift about. For if hundreds gathered on the ridge to feast and raise stone circles, they would have needed food, more food than hunting alone could reliably provide. The sanctuary, in this sense, may not have been a consequence of farming, but its catalyst. The soil of the site holds subtle but important traces. Excavations have uncovered grinding stones, massive slabs of limestone with worn depressions where seeds were crushed into flour, stone sickles, their flint blades showing polish from cutting grasses, hint at systematic harvesting of cereals. Yet, these discoveries stop short of evidence for true farming. The seeds recovered belong to wild varieties, not the domesticated strains that would later define agriculture. No storage silos appear, no fields bounded by walls or ditches. Instead, the evidence suggests a people still moving with the rhythms of the wild, yet already pushing against its boundaries. This liminal state fascinates archaeologists. If Göbekli Tepe was built by foragers, then here we glimpse a society gathering at unprecedented scale without permanent villages or fully domesticated crops. If it was built by early cultivators, then the sanctuary becomes one of the first monumental expressions of a settled world. But perhaps it straddled both conditions, born from a people caught between mobility and permanence, between hunting and planting, between ritual and survival. In this light, Göbekli Tepe becomes more than a temple. It becomes a fulcrum in history. Imagine the seasonal migrations that once crossed this land. Herds of gazelle, vast flocks of birds, stands of ripened barley bending in the summer wind. To sustain construction and ceremony, people may have begun to encourage these cycles, sowing seeds near camps, culling young animals selectively, learning that nature could be bent, however slightly, to human will. Out of the needs of ritual, the roots of agriculture may have deepened. Scholars such as Klaus Schmidt, who led excavations until his passing in 2014, argued that belief may have preceded farming. In his view, the desire to build sanctuaries drew communities together. These gatherings demanded food in abundance, and so, humans began to cultivate the wild, not from necessity alone, but from devotion. In this reversal of traditional chronology, myth and ceremony gave rise to subsistence, not the other way around. Others remain cautious, noting that agriculture is a complex process, unlikely to have been sparked by ritual alone. Still, the idea lingers, haunting, unresolved, that the first farmers were not driven by hunger, but by faith. The broader Fertile Crescent deepens the mystery. At sites such as Abu Huraira in Syria, archaeologists have traced the gradual shift from gathering to cultivation. At Jericho, mud brick towers rise beside evidence of early cereal storage. At Sayonu, communal buildings echo the pattern of special structures distinct from daily houses. Together, these sites form a mosaic of change, each reflecting different steps along the path toward farming life. Within this mosaic, Göbekli Tepe stands as an outlier, monumental, yet without settlement. Its circles of stone seem to belong to a future not yet arrived. The sanctuary's relationship to the Fertile Crescent is also symbolic. Its pillars, bear animals that roamed the valleys, wild boars, foxes, aurochs, vultures, and snakes. Each creature may have carried layered meanings, totems of clans, guardians of thresholds, echoes of constellations. These were not merely animals to be hunted or domesticated. They were woven into cosmology, into myth, into the language of the sacred. Thus, Göbekli Tepe mirrors the Fertile Crescent, not only as a cradle of crops, but as a cradle of symbols. The convergence is striking. In the same hills where wheat bent to human hands, stones were raised toward the sky. In the same valleys, where goats were first herded, pillars were carved with hands, belts, and beings that blurred the line between human and divine. Farming and faith, sustenance and symbol, emerged together, inseparable. The Fertile Crescent cradled both, and Göbekli Tepe may be where they first touched. Yet uncertainty persists. The grinding stones could reflect seasonal feasting, not steady farming. The sickle blades might have harvested wild grasses, not cultivated fields. The feasts could have been supplied by extraordinary hunting, not by the early plough. Each interpretation shifts the role of Göbekli Tepe within history. Was it the spark of agriculture, or its companion? Was it a sanctuary built by foragers, or a temple already rooted in a farming world? Archaeologists continue to search for clarity, sifting through charred seeds, wear marks on tools, and isotopic signatures in bones. But perhaps the ambiguity itself is telling. Göbekli Tepe may embody the threshold itself, a place where humanity stood balanced between worlds, neither fully hunter-gatherer nor fully farmer, but something in between. In its stones we may glimpse not a finished transformation, but a moment of becoming. And so, the sanctuary remains tied to the Fertile Crescent in both fact and mystery. Its soil whispers of wheat not yet tamed. Its carvings recall animals not yet penned. Its gatherings foreshadow societies not yet formed. It is both an ending and a beginning, a monument to the world before farming and a prelude to the world after. As the sun sets over the limestone ridges, casting long shadows across the buried enclosures, the question lingers. Did the hunger for stone and symbol drive humans to sow the first seeds, or did the fields give rise to the sanctuary? The Fertile Crescent offers no final answer. It cradled both, and in that cradle, the story of humanity began to turn. Chapter 14. Connections to Jericho across the hills and plains of the early Neolithic, far from the windswept plateau of southeastern Anatolia. Another experiment in monumentality was unfolding. In the Jordan Valley, nestled at the base of the Judean hills, lies Jericho, often described as the world's oldest continuously inhabited city. Yet, long before it bore walls and bustling markets, Jericho's earliest layers reveal something unexpected. Monumental architecture, rising not from the heart of a dense settlement, but from the threshold between foraging and farming. By around 9000 BCE, Jericho's inhabitants had constructed a massive stone tower, nearly 9 meters tall and conical in shape, set against the inner side of a defensive wall. This tower, built with nothing more than stone, mud, and human labor, stands as one of the earliest known architectural projects of such scale. Its function remains uncertain. Some suggest it was defensive, shielding a growing population from floods or raiders. Others see in it a ritual purpose, a marker aligned with seasonal sunsets or solstices, a monument to cyclical time. In its ambiguity, the Jericho Tower mirrors the enclosures of Göbekli Tepe. Both belong to a world not yet shaped by cities or states, yet already capable of coordination and symbolic expression on a monumental scale. Neither conforms easily to the idea of simple hunter-gatherers. Instead, they whisper of societies far more complex, bound by ritual, memory, and shared effort. Jericho's other revelations deepen the parallel. Among its earliest layers, archaeologists uncovered plastered skulls, human heads stripped of flesh, their features modelled with lime plaster, and shells inserted for eyes. These relics, carefully crafted and preserved, speak of a cult of ancestors, a reverence for the dead that transformed bones into vessels of presence. The living may have gathered around these skulls in rituals of remembrance, summoning the guidance of those who had passed. At Göbekli Tepe, no plastered skulls have been found, yet vultures carved into stone pillars, sometimes poised above headless human figures, suggest a cosmology equally entwined with death and transformation. Just as Jericho's skulls carried ancestors into the realm of the living, Göbekli Tepe's vultures may have signified the passage of the soul, its release from flesh into the unseen. Two sites, separated by distance, seem to echo one another in their symbolic treatment of mortality. The similarities raise questions of connection. Were these communities in contact, exchanging ideas across the Fertile Crescent? Or did parallel circumstances, new ways of living, gathering, and imagining the world, give rise to similar expressions of belief? Archaeology cannot yet decide. The evidence for direct links between Anatolia and the Jordan Valley remains fragmentary. Yet obsidian from Anatolia has been found in Jericho, while shells from the Red Sea have traveled northward. Networks of exchange were real, even in this distant epoch. It is not impossible that stories, rituals, and symbols journeyed alongside materials, stitching together a fabric of shared myth. Still, the differences remind us that each community walked its own path. Jericho reveals signs of early farming, with cereals cultivated in nearby fields and water harnessed from abundant springs. Its tower may have served practical as well as symbolic needs, rising beside a wall that suggests a concern with protection. Göbekli Tepe, in contrast, lacks houses or evidence of permanent habitation. Its enclosures stand apart from daily life, reserved for gatherings and rites. Where Jericho blended the domestic and the sacred, Göbekli Tepe appears to have drawn a sharper boundary, a sanctuary lifted above the ordinary. And yet, the underlying impulse seems shared: to gather, to remember, to build something enduring in stone. At both sites, people who still relied heavily on hunting and gathering found reasons to invest extraordinary labor into structures that served purposes beyond mere survival. They built to express belief, to organize community, to shape the cosmos in architecture. In this, they set the stage for all that followed: the temples of Sumer, the pyramids of Egypt, the sanctuaries of Greece. Jericho's plastered skulls invite another reflection. They embody a form of memory made material, ensuring that the presence of ancestors remained tangible within the community. Could Göbekli Tepe's central pillars, anthropomorphic in their carved belts and hands, have served a similar role, embodying figures of myth or memory, standing as stone ancestors around whom the living gathered? If Jericho preserved the individual, Göbekli Tepe may have abstracted the ancestral into archetype, turning human form into monumental presence. The dialogue between the two sites remains speculative, yet profoundly evocative. Together, they suggest that the early Neolithic Near East was not a patchwork of isolated groups, but a horizon of experimentation, a time when human communities across wide distances wrestled with the same questions: how to honor the dead, how to gather the living, how to shape time and cosmos in enduring form. Whether through towers or enclosures, skulls or vultures, these answers were written in stone and ritual. Archaeologists continue to probe both sites, yet many questions remain open. Was Jericho's tower aligned with celestial events, marking the rhythm of seasons as Göbekli Tepe may have done with its carvings? Were the plastered skulls part of ancestor cults that resonated northward, influencing the symbolism of the Anatolian plateau? Or are we witnessing independent inventions, parallel expressions of a deeper transformation of the human mind? As the evening light fades across the Jordan Valley, the Tower of Jericho casts its shadow much as it did 10,000 years ago. And far to the north, beneath a hill long buried, the stone pillars of Göbekli Tepe remain frozen in silence. Two places, contemporary, distinct, yet strangely resonant. The dialogue between them is not spoken in words but in echoes. Echoes of stone towers, of silent skulls, of vultures carved in limestone. We are left to wonder whether these echoes carried across the Fertile Crescent in the voices of ancient travelers, or whether they arose independently, born from the shared condition of a humanity standing at the dawn of settled life. The answer remains just beyond reach, hidden in the soil, in the gaps between stones, in the silence of time. Chapter 15. Parallels with Çatalhöyük. The heart of central Anatolia, nearly 2 millennia after the last stones were raised at Göbekli Tepe, another world emerged. Around 7500 BCE on the Konya plain, the settlement of Çatalhöyük rose from the earth, dense, labyrinthine, and unlike anything that had come before. Where Göbekli Tepe stood isolated on a barren ridge, Çatalhöyük spread across the plain in a honeycomb of mud brick homes, a living organism of humanity pressed tightly together. It was not a sanctuary apart from life. It was life itself, structured as ritual, infused with meaning. Here, houses touched one another wall to wall, There were no streets, only rooftops, serving as pathways and gathering spaces. To enter a dwelling, one descended from the roof through a ladder, stepping directly into rooms that were equal parts domestic and sacred. Within these spaces, people cooked, slept, gave birth and died. And beneath these floors, in shallow graves dug into the earth of their own homes, they buried their dead. The walls of Çatalhöyük spoke in colours and symbols. Painted murals depicted leaping leopards, aurochs, and abstract geometric forms. Some show vultures hovering above headless human bodies, a motif that echoes with uncanny familiarity the imagery carved into the limestone pillars of Göbekli Tepe. Across centuries and landscapes, the vulture recurs as a symbol of death and transformation, a mediator between flesh and spirit. Was this continuity of belief carried forward from earlier sanctuaries, or did these images emerge anew, shaped by the enduring human confrontation with mortality? Unlike Göbekli Tepe, where ritual spaces were monumental and communal, Çatalhöyük's sacred was woven into the fabric of daily life. Shrines stood inside houses, decorated with plastered bull skulls set into walls, their horns protruding into the space of the living. The dead were not distant. They rested beneath sleeping platforms, their presence continuing among the living. In some cases, skulls were retrieved from graves, plastered and painted, then returned again. Life and death, ritual and routine were inseparable. The settlement itself reveals another profound shift. At Göbekli Tepe, there is no evidence of farming or permanent habitation, only feasting and ritual. At Çatalhöyük, agriculture had taken root. People cultivated wheat and barley, herded domesticated sheep and goats, and stored surplus grain within their homes. The rhythms of ritual were now bound to the rhythms of subsistence. Belief had not vanished, it had transformed, adapting to the new conditions of settled life. This raises a tantalizing question. Was Çatalhöyük a direct heir to the worldview expressed at Göbekli Tepe, or a parallel experiment in meaning? Archaeologists remain divided. The continuity of symbols, vultures, headless bodies, wild animals rendered with reverence, suggests a shared symbolic horizon stretching across Anatolia. Yet the differences are equally striking. Göbekli Tepe placed ritual above habitation, its enclosures serving as gathering spaces for scattered groups. Çatalhöyük collapsed that separation, embedding ritual within the household, dissolving the boundary between sacred and mundane. Some scholars see in this shift the domestication of belief itself. As communities settled, their cosmologies settled with them. What had once been expressed in towering monoliths became reimagined in clay figurines, wall paintings, and household shrines. The gods, or ancestors, who once stood in the open air beneath the stars, now dwelt within the plastered walls of mud-brick homes. Yet other questions linger. Did the people of Çatalhöyük remember Göbekli Tepe? Were stories of distant sanctuaries carried down through generations, their symbols reinterpreted for new lives rooted in fields and herds? Or did both sites reflect recurring archetypes within the human imagination, images of vultures, bulls, and transformation that emerge wherever people confront death, survival, and the mysteries of existence? Excavations at Çatalhöyük, led by James Mellart in the 1960s and later by Ian Hodder, revealed more than architecture. They uncovered the intimate dialogue between living and dead. Skeletons show signs of secondary burial, of bones moved and rearranged. Infants were buried beneath hearths, women beneath sleeping platforms, men beneath thresholds. The arrangement seems deliberate, suggesting roles or relationships that extended beyond life. Just as at Göbekli Tepe, where enclosures may have functioned as cosmic diagrams, Çatalhöyük's households were microcosms, each a universe of memory, ritual, and continuity, and there are hints that the settlement itself was a symbolic landscape. One mural, often called the world's first map, may depict the clustered houses of Çatalhöyük, with a volcanic mountain looming behind. Perhaps Hasan Dağ, a peak that occasionally erupted in antiquity. If so, the image suggests that these early farmers were already mapping not only their homes but their place in a wider cosmos, tethering themselves to land, mountain, and sky. The parallels with Göbekli Tepe are both striking and elusive. Both sites speak of communities investing extraordinary labor into expressions of meaning beyond survival. Both are saturated with imagery of animals, wild and powerful presences invoked through art. Both engage with death in ways that blur boundaries between ritual and life. Yet where Göbekli Tepe looms in isolation, Çatalhöyük teems with domestic intimacy. One stands as a sanctuary on a hill, the other as a living city of shrines. In this contrast, we glimpse the broader transformation of the Neolithic world. The builders of Göbekli Tepe gathered in seasonal rituals, perhaps binding scattered groups through feasts and ceremonies. The inhabitants of Çatalhöyük lived together year-round, weaving ritual into daily routine. Belief was no longer an event apart. It was an ever-present rhythm of life. And still, mysteries remain. Were the vultures of Çatalhöyük direct descendants of Göbekli Tepe's stone reliefs? Did the bull skulls mounted in houses echo the aurochs once hunted on the plains around the earlier sanctuary? Was the memory of a monumental past preserved in whispers, stories, and symbols, even as life shifted from ritual centers to permanent villages? Or are we, in our search for continuity, weaving threads where the past was more fractured, more diverse than we imagine? Çatalhöyük reminds us that the Neolithic was not a straight path, but a mosaic of experiments in living and meaning. Some communities built sanctuaries apart from life. Others embedded the sacred within their homes. Some carved stone, others molded clay. All sought to anchor themselves in a world newly transformed by farming, community, and memory. As we stand in the silent rooms of Çatalhöyük today, the echoes of Göbekli Tepe linger in the air. The dialogue between them is not one of direct inheritance, but of resonance, a shared exploration of what it means to be human at the threshold of history. One sanctuary rose and was buried. Another settlement thrived for centuries, then fell silent. Both remain as testaments to the earliest flowering of symbolic thought, bound together not by certainty, but by questions that endure. And so the story continues, from open-air sanctuaries to crowded settlements, from monumental pillars to painted walls. Across millennia, the thread of human imagination runs unbroken, weaving belief into stone, clay, and memory. Yet whether that thread connects these places directly, or whether they are parallel songs in the vast chorus of the Neolithic, remains a mystery we may never fully resolve. Chapter 16. The role of shamans and specialists who stood at the center of the circles of stone, who lifted their voice before the carved pillars, before the animal spirits frozen in limestone, before the vast silence of the sky. At Göbekli Tepe, the question of leadership, of ritual guidance, has no clear answer. The site gives us pillars, carvings, bones, and architecture, but no names, no written records, no hierarchies carved into clay. And yet something, or someone, must have held the threads of meaning together. The complexity of the enclosures, the staggering coordination of feasts, and the shaping of monolithic stones suggest roles beyond spontaneous gathering. They suggest specialists, ritual leaders, shamans, interpreters of the unseen. Archaeologists have long debated the origins of organized religion. At Göbekli Tepe, dating back more than 11,000 years, the debate takes on sharper edges. The circles were raised by communities of hunters and gatherers, groups without settled kings, without cities, without bureaucracies. Yet these people managed to quarry, carve, and transport stones weighing up to 50 tons, arranging them into sanctuaries of precision and form. Such labor demands more than raw strength. It requires vision. It requires leadership. But what kind? In the absence of palaces, we find no evidence of kingship. No thrones, no golden ornaments, no hoards of wealth buried in secret. The bones unearthed speak instead of wild feasts. Gazelle, aurochs, red deer, countless birds. The refuse tells us of gatherings, communal celebrations, and ritual excess. These were not the quiet offerings of a single household. They were collective events, orchestrated at scale. Across the anthropology of hunter-gatherer societies, one pattern returns: the presence of the shaman, not ruler in the political sense, but mediator between worlds. The shaman does not govern by law or decree, but by charisma, knowledge, and access to the unseen. In Siberia, in the Amazon, in prehistoric Europe, the shaman stands at the threshold, moving between the everyday and the eternal. It is here, in the imaginal and the symbolic, that parallels to Göbekli Tepe emerge. The twin central pillars of each enclosure, towering, anthropomorphic, yet faceless, have often been read as representations of ancestors, spirits, or deities. Around them gather the carved foxes, lions, vultures, and serpents. Perhaps in the deep darkness of the Neolithic night, a figure stood between those pillars, chanting, invoking, breathing life into the stones. A shaman, clad in animal skins, adorned with talons, feathers, or antlers, carrying the memory of myths unrecorded. And yet, there is silence where hierarchy might be. Excavations have revealed no houses of prestige, no graves weighted with treasures that would set one person apart from the rest. At sites like Çatalhöyük, centuries later, we begin to glimpse variation in burials, signs of differentiation. But at Göbekli Tepe, such signs are absent. The sanctuaries may have been raised by equals, drawn together not by coercion, but by a shared pull towards something transcendent. Still, organization was necessary. The quarrying of stone, the transport of pillars, the coordination of hundreds of hands, these acts suggest leaders of some kind. But leadership in such a world may not have been fixed. Perhaps roles shifted with the seasons, with the stories, with the cycles of migration. One person might hold authority in ritual, another in hunting, another in the mysteries of plants. The sanctuary may have been the meeting place where these strands converged, under the guidance of those most attuned to spirit and symbol. Consider the feasts, vast gatherings of people from distant valleys and hills. Archaeologists have found enormous stone troughs, capable of brewing beer-like drinks, remnants of barley and einkorn mixed with wild legumes. Such offerings suggest celebration, intoxication, perhaps altered states of consciousness. Across the world, shamans enter the unseen through trance, through rhythm, through substances that open the gates of perception. Could the gatherings at Göbekli Tepe have been moments of collective transformation, guided by those who knew the paths into altered vision? In nearby caves carved long before Göbekli Tepe, we see figures with animal heads, half human, half spirit. In the caves of France, in the art of Upper Paleolithic Europe, the sorcerer motif appears, the figure who is both man and beast, intermediary and guide. The pillars at Göbekli Tepe, with their human arms and animal belts, echo this liminality. They suggest beings not entirely of this world, but close enough to touch. If such imagery framed the sanctuaries, then ritual specialists may have played the role of embodying these beings, giving voice to their stories, interpreting their presence. But caution is necessary. The temptation to project later priesthoods backward onto Göbekli Tepe can mislead. We must not imagine temples staffed by rigid hierarchies, as in Sumer or Egypt thousands of years later. At Göbekli Tepe, the evidence does not point to bureaucracy. Instead, it points to fluidity, to charisma, to knowledge held in memory and symbol rather than text. The specialist here may not have been a permanent class, but a role carried by those chosen or compelled by visions, dreams, or communal recognition. Archaeologist Klaus Schmidt, who led excavations for more than a decade, often emphasized that Göbekli Tepe was a sanctuary, not a settlement. People came here, gathered, performed rituals, and left. In such a place, memory itself became architecture. The stones were not only physical, they were mnemonic. Each animal, each gesture carved into the limestone, carried stories, warnings, cosmologies. Someone had to interpret them, to keep the stories alive across generations. Without writing, such knowledge would vanish unless carried by living specialists, the walking libraries of the early Neolithic. Across world traditions, such figures are also healers. Shamans treat illness not only as a physical condition, but as a disruption in balance between worlds. At Göbekli Tepe, with its vulture imagery and hints of excarnation, the exposure of bodies to the elements, ritual specialists may have overseen the passage of the dead, guiding souls into the realm of ancestors. The imagery of birds, snakes, and headless figures suggests a complex cosmology of death and renewal. To guide such rites would require not only courage but deep symbolic authority. And yet, questions remain unanswered. Was authority vested in one or in many? Were these rituals seasonal gatherings where shamans from scattered bands converged? Or did local lineages guard the sanctuaries across centuries? Was charisma enough to command hundreds to carve, drag, and erect stone? Or was there something deeper, a binding mythology, a promise of cosmic order that drew people together in common cause? When we look at the polished limestone, we are gazing into silence. The stones do not tell us if a single voice rose above the rest, or if many voices blended in chorus. They do not tell us if shamans walked in trance between the pillars, or if the rituals belonged to the collective body of the people. But they suggest the necessity of guidance, of roles that bound community to cosmos, memory to stone, flesh to eternity. And so we stand at the threshold of speculation, surrounded by silence and carved animals. Somewhere in that silence once voices rose. Somewhere in those circles, someone mediated between the living and the unseen. Was it a shaman cloaked in feathers, a seer speaking visions of the sky, a healer guiding souls through death's passage? Or was it the people themselves, joined together in collective ceremony with no single leader at all? The answer remains buried in time, beneath the soil that once covered the sanctuary, beneath the weight of millennia. The stones are silent, but they are not empty. They carry traces of memory, of roles once played, of voices once heard. They whisper of specialists whose knowledge we no longer possess, whose authority was carved not in crowns or thrones, but in the unseen fabric of story and ritual. And as we listen, leaning closer to the silence, we hear only the faintest echo, the possibility that memory itself was the true specialist, and that those who carried it lived not for themselves, but for the stories that the pillars still guard. The sanctuary remains open, unresolved. The question of leadership lingers, suspended between speculation and stone, waiting for the next layer of history to be uncovered. Chapter 17. The Skull Cult. Evidence among the stones of Göbekli Tepe, amid the carved foxes and coiling serpents, archaeologists have uncovered something more intimate, more unsettling. Fragments of human skulls. Bone marked by deliberate incisions, etched with cuts too deep and precise to be mistaken for accident. In these fragments, we glimpse not only the lives of those who once gathered on the hill, but also their deaths and the ways the human body itself was drawn into ritual. In 2017, a team working at the site revealed 3 skulls unlike any found before in Anatolia. They bore long, deliberate grooves running across the cranium, marks that could only have been made by sharp flint tools wielded with intent. Some cuts were deep enough to suggest not mere defleshing, but modification, an effort to shape the skull for suspension, display, or repeated handling. These were not random relics of burial. They were artifacts of belief. Such evidence calls to mind what archaeologists call the skull cults of the Neolithic Near East. At Jericho, hundreds of miles to the south, human skulls were removed from their bodies, plastered with lime and modelled with shells for eyes. These plastered skulls were carefully arranged and displayed, transforming the dead into enduring presences within the living community. At Tel Karamel in Syria, skulls were similarly curated, displayed, or deposited in ritual contexts. Across the Fertile Crescent, the human head appears to have been seen as more than flesh and bone. It was a vessel of memory, identity, and perhaps sacred power. At Göbekli Tepe, no such plastered skulls have yet been found, but the carved grooves in the bone suggest a practice no less deliberate. One skull fragment even bears puncture marks at its crown, interpreted by some as evidence that it may have been hung on cords, suspended for display within the sanctuaries. If true, it means that amid the towering limestone pillars and animal reliefs, the dead themselves were present, not hidden in graves, but revealed, integrated into the living fabric of ritual. What purpose did these altered skulls serve? Were they trophies of violence, reminders of victory carried into the sanctuary to mark conquest and dominance? Or were they relics of venerated elders, ancestors whose memory needed to be anchored in stone and bone alike? Perhaps they were offerings, given to the central beings carved into the pillars, foxes, lions, vultures, sacrificed not in blood but in the symbolic presence of the human head, the seat of vision and voice. The imagery carved on Göbekli Tepe's pillars deepens the mystery. Among the animals are depictions of headless human figures, often with vultures hovering above. This imagery recalls the paintings of Çatalhöyük, where vultures loom above corpses, and the plastered skulls of Jericho, where the head itself became the locus of ritual. Was there, across this vast region, a shared symbolic language of decapitation and transformation? Did the people of the early Neolithic see the separation of head from body as a necessary step in the journey of the soul, or as a way of reclaiming power from the dead? The skull, after all, has always carried a dual symbolism. It is the remnant of mortality, the most visceral reminder of death. Yet it is also the enduring vessel of identity, the one part of the body that persists long after flesh has vanished. To keep a skull is to keep a presence. To carve it is to alter that presence, binding it into new meaning. The carved skulls of Göbekli Tepe are few in number, only 3 fragments, among tens of thousands of bones recovered from the mound. Yet their rarity may make them more significant, not less. If they were part of routine burial practices, more would be expected. Their scarcity suggests instead that they were reserved for specific individuals, perhaps chosen for their role, their power, or their memory. They may have been ancestors whose authority extended beyond death, or figures whose remains were believed to protect or sanctify the rituals carried out among the stones. And yet another possibility lingers, that these skulls were not venerated, but feared, carved, suspended, and displayed not to honor but to neutralize. Perhaps they belonged to outsiders, enemies taken in conflict. Their skulls hung as warnings or bound into ritual to transform threat into protection. The ambiguity remains, for the stones preserve evidence, not intention. The question of violence cannot be dismissed. Human remains at other Neolithic sites sometimes bear signs of trauma, blunt force injuries, cut marks, defleshing. Were these acts of reverence or of brutality? Or was the boundary between the two less clear to the people of the early Neolithic than it is to us? For a community that carved vultures devouring headless bodies into its pillars, the display of skulls may not have carried the same dread we instinctively feel. It may have been a way of placing the dead into dialogue with the living, of embodying the cycles of death and renewal in physical form. What is certain is that these carved skulls root the mysteries of Göbekli Tepe not only in stone, but in flesh. The sanctuary was not an abstract space of symbols alone. It was also a place where the human body itself became symbol, where bones could be shaped and given new roles in the theatre of ritual. The monumental pillars, carved with foxes and scorpions, were accompanied by the presence of real human remains, the most direct material of all. We are left with fragments, both literal and metaphorical. 3 skulls carved with grooves, a scattering of headless figures in art. The parallels of Jericho and Tel Caramel, where the dead were reimagined through plaster, paint, and ritual display. Together they suggest a network of belief, where the head was not merely a relic, but a sacred object, an artifact of transformation. And yet, as always at Göbekli Tepe, the questions outweigh the answers. Were these skulls raised high in the enclosures, watching as ceremonies unfolded beneath the looming pillars? Were they hidden, revealed only in moments of initiation or sacrifice? Did they belong to leaders, ancestors, enemies, or something in between? The grooves carved into bone are undeniable, but the stories they carried have slipped beyond reach. Here, at the heart of the sanctuary, the stones and the bones speak together, whispering of rituals we cannot fully comprehend. The skull cult evidence draws us closer to the people of Göbekli Tepe, not only to their art, but to their bodies, to the way they understood the line between life and death, memory and forgetting, and yet it leaves us suspended, like the skulls themselves may once have been, hanging in silence, waiting for meaning to return. Chapter 18. Symbolism of the fox. Among the many creatures etched into the standing stones of Göbekli Tepe, one appears with a striking persistence. The fox. Sleek, elongated, often shown in motion, its body curves along the limestone pillars as though frozen mid-stride. No other animal, save perhaps the vulture or serpent, is depicted with such frequency across the enclosures. And yet, unlike the aurochs with their massive horns, or the boar with their formidable strength, the fox was not an animal of dominance or raw power. Its significance lay elsewhere, in qualities more elusive, more liminal, harder to grasp. The fox moves between worlds. It hunts at twilight, emerging in the hours when light and darkness intermingle. It is cunning, adaptable, capable of navigating landscapes both wild and near human settlement. In the ethnographies of countless societies, the fox carries symbolic weight. In East Asia, it is a shapeshifter, a being able to cross the fragile boundaries between spirit and flesh. In Native American traditions, it may appear as a trickster, disrupting order to bring hidden truths. In European folklore, it is clever, sly, and always on the margins of human habitation. Such motifs repeat across continents, carried by oral traditions that may stretch back into the very mists of prehistory. At Göbekli Tepe, dating to the 10th millennium BCE, the recurrence of fox imagery demands attention. On Pillar 38, in Enclosure D, a fox strides vertically, as though ascending toward the sky. In Enclosure B, another is carved in profile, its slender body stretched across the stone. These are not incidental decorations. They are deliberate, repeated, and enduring across multiple phases of construction. Whatever the fox meant, it mattered deeply to the people who gathered here. Some scholars suggest that the fox functioned as a clan totem. Among hunter-gatherer societies, Animals often served as emblems of kinship groups, markers of identity carried into ritual and myth. If so, the fox may have represented a specific community, a lineage whose role at the sanctuary was distinct. The pillars bearing foxes could then have been places of gathering, of memory, of ritual specific to those bound by the animal's sign. But the fox also carries meanings that reach beyond the practical. Its liminality, dwelling between day and night, wild and near human, predator yet rarely dominant, mirrors the role of the shaman, the mediator who moves between realms. It is possible that the fox was not merely a symbol of group identity, but of transformation itself, an emblem of the passage from one state of being to another. The archaeological record offers subtle hints. On one pillar, a fox appears in proximity to human-like arms, carved along the sides of the stone. The blending of human and animal forms is not unique to Göbekli Tepe. It is a motif found in Upper Paleolithic cave art across Europe, where hybrid beings embody the permeability of the human-animal boundary. Such imagery is often associated with ritual, vision, or mythic narrative. At Göbekli Tepe, the fox may have been part of this same symbolic vocabulary, a figure who crossed thresholds, guiding the living into altered states, or the dead into the realm of ancestors. The fox's behavior in the wild may also have inspired reverence. Its ability to vanish quickly, to slip unseen into brush or shadow, would have seemed uncanny to early hunters. Unlike the aurochs or deer, it was not prized for meat in great quantities, but for qualities more subtle: stealth, survival, intelligence. In societies where animals were not merely resources but teachers, embodiments of traits to emulate, the fox stood as a model of adaptability in a world of constant change. And there is another layer. Across multiple enclosures, foxes are not only present, but prominent. Their placement suggests they held enduring importance across centuries of building. If the enclosures were constructed by successive generations, the fox became part of a shared symbolic code, recognizable to all who came. Whether as clan emblem, mythic mediator, or trickster spirit, the fox endured as a figure worth carving again and again into stone. Comparative mythology deepens the mystery. In Mesopotamian tradition, thousands of years after Göbekli Tepe, the fox appears in the myth of the goddess Ninhursag as her loyal messenger, a being capable of traversing between divine and earthly realms. In Persian lore, the fox was considered cunning but also protective against evil. Though distant in time, such echoes remind us that animal symbolism often persists, carrying ancient resonances into later civilizations. It is not impossible that the sacred role of the fox at Göbekli Tepe reverberated across millennia, transformed but not forgotten. We must also consider the possibility of the fox as trickster. Trickster figures are paradoxical. They deceive, but their deception often reveals hidden truths. They disrupt order, but in doing so, they renew it. At Göbekli Tepe, where the stones themselves seem to mediate between life and death, earth and sky, human and animal, the fox may have been the necessary reminder that boundaries are porous, that order is fragile, that transformation is always near. Yet, as with all at Göbekli Tepe, the silence of the stones resists final interpretation. Was the fox adored as ancestor, feared as deceiver, invoked as guide? Was it painted with ochre, its image renewed with each generation of worshippers? Did shamans wear fox pelts as they moved in trance around the enclosures, embodying its agility and cunning? Or did clans gather beneath its carved form, invoking the animal as their totem, their emblem of belonging? We cannot know, but we can listen to the persistence of its image, repeated across stone after stone. We can sense its presence not as mere decoration, but as participant in the sacred order. The builders chose carefully. Every carving had meaning. Every animal carried weight. The fox, woven into pillar and myth alike, speaks to qualities not easily reduced to words. Qualities of liminality, cunning, survival, and transformation. The sanctuary of Göbekli Tepe was not a place of random adornment. It was a deliberate cosmos, where animals and humans alike were inscribed into an order both symbolic and sacred. The fox walked through that cosmos with a grace that compelled memory. Its slender body, forever etched into stone, remains as silent testimony to a worldview where animals were not separate from the sacred, but embodiments of it. As we stand before these carvings today, we are reminded that the fox, though silent, still gazes back at us. It slips between interpretation and mystery, refusing capture. just as it eluded hunters long ago. Perhaps that is its final lesson, that some truths remain hidden, glimpsed only in passing, just as the fox itself appears at dusk, moving between worlds. And so the fox of Göbekli Tepe endures, not only as an animal once known, but as a symbol woven into the very fabric of the sanctuary, a messenger from a forgotten cosmos whose meaning hovers just beyond our grasp. Chapter 19. The Enigmatic Pillar 43. Vulture Stone. Among the stones of Göbekli Tepe, one stands apart. It is not the tallest nor the most imposing, yet its surface carries a message more intricate, more layered than perhaps any other at the site. This is Pillar 43, often called the Vulture Stone. Its carvings weave a dense tapestry of vultures, scorpions, abstract signs, and a headless human figure. A tableau that has drawn more speculation than any other single artifact of the Neolithic world. When archaeologists first uncovered Pillar 43, they were struck by its unusual density of imagery. Unlike many of the other pillars, which feature a single animal carved in bold relief, this one is crowded, almost overflowing with forms. A large vulture dominates the scene, its wings outstretched, as if presiding over the tableau. Beneath it, a human figure appears without a head, its body truncated, almost dissolving into the stone. Around these central forms, other creatures appear, scorpions, birds, and strange abstract motifs that resist easy interpretation. The vulture is perhaps the key. Across Göbekli Tepe, vultures appear again and again, always in association with death, with the transformation of the body into something beyond itself. At Çatalhöyük too, vultures hover over headless corpses in wall paintings, reinforcing the sense of continuity between these sites. In many ancient cultures, vultures were understood as psychopomps, guides of the soul, mediators between the living and the dead. Their role was to strip flesh from bone, but also, symbolically, to carry the spirit into the next realm. Pillar 43 may therefore echo the rituals of excarnation practiced here, where the dead were left exposed for vultures before their bones were gathered, curated, or transformed into ritual objects. Yet the stone resists being read as a mere funerary scene. Some researchers have suggested that its arrangement corresponds not to earthly death, but to the heavens themselves. In 2017, a team led by Martin Sweatman and Dimitrios Tsikritsis proposed that the carvings encode a celestial map, a snapshot of the night sky around 10,950 BCE. According to their reading, the scorpion corresponds to the constellation Scorpius, the vulture to Cygnus, and other animals to recognizable star groups. They argued that the imagery commemorates a catastrophic event, a comet impact, possibly linked to the Younger Dryas, a sudden return to glacial conditions that transformed the climate of the early Holocene. This interpretation sparked both fascination and controversy. Could hunter-gatherers of the 10th millennium BCE have recorded an astronomical event with such precision? Could they have recognized patterns in the stars and carved them into stone as warnings, as memory, as myth encoded for the ages? Skeptics caution that such readings risk imposing modern constellations onto ancient imagery, creating patterns that may not have existed in the minds of the carvers. They remind us that the Neolithic worldview need not mirror our own scientific categories. What we see as stars and disasters, they may have seen as spirits, animals, or divine beings. And yet, the possibility lingers. If Pillar 43 does indeed carry astronomical meaning, it would suggest that Göbekli Tepe was not only a sanctuary of ritual, but also a place of sky-watching, where cosmic cycles were inscribed in stone. It would imply that the people who gathered here were not only builders and carvers, but also observers of the heavens, keeping time through patterns of light and shadow, preparing rituals not just for the dead, but for the cosmos itself. Between these interpretations, the funerary, the astronomical, the mythological, there is no resolution. Instead, they overlap, creating a palimpsest of meanings that resist closure. The headless human figure only deepens the mystery. Was it a victim of ritual decapitation, a symbol of transformation, or a metaphor for humanity's vulnerability before the vast forces of nature and sky? Some see in it a reminder of mortality, a warning that life is fragile, dependent on forces beyond control. Others see in it initiation, the stripping away of self in order to enter a higher realm of meaning. The abstract symbols carved into the stone complicate matters further. Rectangles, circles, and H-shaped signs appear across the pillar's surface, recurring motifs at Göbekli Tepe whose meanings remain opaque. Some liken them to enclosures themselves, architectural forms echoing the very structures within which they were carved. Others see them as representations of portals, thresholds between worlds. In the context of Pillar 43, they could mark the passage from life to death, from earth to sky, from known to unknown. What is most striking about the Vulture Stone is its density of narrative. Unlike the stark elegance of the twin central pillars in Enclosure D, Pillar 43 overwhelms with detail, as if attempting to capture an entire cosmology in a single slab of limestone. It is both picture and text, both myth and memory. It seems designed to be read, contemplated, retold, not merely to stand as decoration, but to serve as a medium of knowledge. The fact that it has survived nearly 12,000 years is itself remarkable. The deliberate backfilling of Göbekli Tepe preserved the pillar in pristine condition, its carvings sharp despite the weight of centuries. That act of burial may have been as symbolic as the carving itself, an effort to seal away knowledge, to close a chapter in ritual life whose meaning was not meant to be erased, but concealed until rediscovered. Today, Pillar 43 stands at the threshold of interpretation, suspended between archaeology and myth, science and speculation. It invites every gaze to see something different, a funerary ritual frozen in stone, an astronomical map warning of catastrophe, a mythological narrative of transformation, or perhaps all of these at once. The stone holds its silence, while those who study it speak in competing voices, each trying to translate an ancient language without a lexicon. And yet, perhaps that is its true power. Pillar 43 resists reduction. It cannot be confined to a single meaning. It embodies the ambiguity of Göbekli Tepe itself, monumental yet fragile, specific yet universal, ancient yet strangely familiar. Like the vultures it depicts, it hovers at the threshold, mediating between the world of the living and the realms we cannot fully grasp. As the sun sets over the Anatolian plateau and shadows lengthen across the excavated enclosures, the carvings of Pillar 43 catch the fading light. Its vultures stretch their wings once more. Its headless figure stares from eternity. Its scorpions crawl silently across the stone. And we, standing thousands of years removed, are left with the same question that must have haunted its carvers. What is it that endures? And what is it that passes away? The Vulture Stone does not answer. It only lingers, enigmatic, watching, waiting, its meaning suspended like a skull on a cord, poised between worlds. Chapter 20. Carved Hands and Human Imagery. In the sanctuary of Göbekli Tepe, animals rule the stone. Foxes prowl along the pillars. Serpents coil. Vultures stretch their wings toward the void. Yet, amid this bestiary of power and mystery, there are faint echoes of the human form. Subtle, partial, never complete. It is as if humanity wished to leave its trace, but only in fragments. Hands without faces, torsos without eyes, arms folded into the geometry of stone. These traces whisper that the sanctuary was not only the domain of animals and spirits, but also of human-like beings, perhaps ancestors, perhaps deities, perhaps something in between. The most striking example lies at the heart of Enclosure D, the largest and most elaborate of the circular sanctuaries. Two towering central pillars stand in silent opposition, their flat faces directed inward toward each other. Along their sides are carved elongated arms descending down the length of the stone. The arms end in hands, fingers curling to meet at the front of the pillar's surface. On one, the left hand reaches across the belly. On the other, the right hand mirrors the gesture. Between them, the two pillars seem to form a pair, a mirrored duality of beings standing face to face. These figures are not fully human. They are monumental in scale, faceless, their heads replaced by massive T-shaped tops. They stand not as portraits, but as abstractions of the human body, stripped of individuality, elevated into the symbolic. Yet the presence of hands grounds them. Hands are intimate, recognizably ours. They remind us of touch, of craft, of ritual gesture. To carve arms and hands into stone is to affirm that what stands here is not only animal, not only spirit, but something with a human essence. Elsewhere, the imagery grows stranger. On a pillar from Enclosure H, a human figure appears headless, its body twisted, flanked by vultures and scorpions. The absence of the head is deliberate. Was it a depiction of death, of excarnation, the ritual exposure of the body to birds of prey? Or was it symbolic, representing the severing of mortal identity, the transformation into spirit? To depict humanity without its face is to deny individuality. What remains is the universal body, stripped of the self, entering another order of existence. Belt motifs also appear, carved into the central pillars. On Enclosure D's massive stones, belts encircle the figure's waists, adorned with fox pelts hanging down, stylized in relief. These are not incidental decorations, but symbols of clothing, of adornment, of status. A belt marks a being as dressed, as more than animal. Yet again, no faces appear. The builders chose to show hands, arms, belts, even loincloths, but not eyes, not mouths, not the seat of identity. The absence is haunting. In prehistoric art across the world, we see both animals and humans, painted figures in caves, carved figurines of the Venus type, human faces etched into bone and ivory. At Göbekli Tepe, by contrast, the human face is missing. Why? What did it mean to show humanity only in partial form? Was it a taboo, a prohibition against fixing the human essence in stone? Or was it a conscious choice to emphasize animals and spirits as primary, with human beings secondary, humble participants in a greater cosmological drama? Anthropology offers possible parallels. In many societies, the human face is considered too powerful to represent directly. In ancient Mesopotamia, masks were used in rituals to stand in for the human visage, mediating its power. Among indigenous peoples of the Americas, depictions of human faces are sometimes avoided for fear of trapping the spirit. Could Göbekli Tepe reflect a similar anxiety? The belief that to carve a human face would bind or endanger the soul. Alternatively, the faceless pillars may represent not living humans at all, but ancestors or deities. By omitting faces, the builders allowed these beings to remain universal, archetypal, unbound by individual identity. The T-shaped tops could symbolize heads, but without features, they resist personhood. They stand as forms beyond individuality, embodiments of forces larger than any one life. The carved hands deepen this mystery. Hands are agents of action. They grasp, they shape, they bless, they strike. By carving hands onto the central pillars, the builders may have been marking these beings as active participants in ritual, guardians whose invisible gestures shape the sanctuary's order. Yet the hands rest not in aggression, but in stillness, crossed at the belly, as though in containment, in balance. The posture is not one of violence, but of presence, watchful and enduring. Some archaeologists suggest that the central pillars themselves are anthropomorphic beings, perhaps the embodiment of gods or mythic ancestors. If so, the arms, hands, and belts are not decorative but essential identifiers. These are not abstract stones. They are bodies, clothed and poised, standing as the axis of the sanctuary. Around them, the animal reliefs form a world. Predators, prey, birds, insects. The human-like pillars rise in the midst of this cosmos, mediators between human and animal, between earth and sky. Yet, the scarcity of explicit human imagery beyond these pillars is telling. Animals dominate. The sanctuary seems to proclaim a worldview in which humans were not the central figures of creation. Instead, they were part of a larger order, humbled before the power of beasts and the unseen. To depict humans sparingly, and then only in partial form, may have been a deliberate reflection of this belief. There is also the possibility of fear. The act of carving is an act of power. To inscribe an animal into stone may have been to honor it, to bind its spirit, to ensure its presence in ritual. But to inscribe a human face might have been dangerous, an act too intimate, too binding. Perhaps the builders feared that to capture the human visage was to risk capturing the soul itself, and so they left the faces blank, leaving only the gestures of arms and hands, the markers of clothing, the outline of form. Across the sanctuary, other fragments of human imagery appear. Small figurines, fragmentary and stylized, have been unearthed among the debris. Some depict headless humans, others partial torsos. None offer a full portrait. These broken pieces mirror the larger pattern. Humanity glimpsed, but never complete, always fragmented. It is as if the builders were comfortable with partial presence, but recoiled from full representation. This restraint invites comparison with other ancient sites. At Çatalhöyük, built some 2,000 years later, human imagery is far more explicit. Plastered skulls, figurines, paintings of hunters. There, the human face emerges more clearly. But at Göbekli Tepe, older by millennia, the emphasis remains elsewhere. It is a world still dominated by animals, where humanity carves itself only in shadow. Perhaps this reflects the psychological distance of the era. At the threshold between Paleolithic hunting and Neolithic cultivation, humans were still negotiating their place in the cosmos. They had not yet enthroned themselves as rulers over animals. Instead, they carved sanctuaries where foxes, vultures, lions, and snakes held primacy. Humanity appeared only in traces, as though acknowledging its secondary role, still subordinate to the spirits of the wild. And so, the carved hands and human imagery of Göbekli Tepe remain one of its most haunting enigmas. They show us that people saw themselves in the sanctuary, but only indirectly, only partially. They placed their hands upon the stone, but left their faces absent. They clothed their pillars with belts and fox pelts, but left their eyes uncarved. They gave themselves presence, but not identity. Was this humility before the animal powers? Was it fear of capturing the human soul in stone? Or was it reverence, a refusal to reduce the human essence to likeness? We cannot know, but we can stand before the faceless pillars and feel their presence. Immense, watchful, haunting. They remind us that humanity once placed itself not at the center, but at the margins, content to appear in fragments. While the animals ruled the sacred space, in the end, the carved hands are like gestures across time. They reach out from the stone across 12 millennia to remind us that human presence was never absent, only hidden, only partial, only glimpsed in passing. And their silence asks us still, why did the builders leave the human face unwritten? What truth did they guard in that omission? The answer lingers in shadow, etched into stone, waiting for us in the unfinished stories of Göbekli Tepe. Chapter 21. Astronomy and the Sky Watchers high on the limestone ridge, where the winds sweep across the Harran Plain. The builders of Göbekli Tepe raised circles of stone open to the sky. From their hilltop vantage, no mountain or forest blocked the horizon. The dawn and the dusk, the moon's phases, and the arc of the stars would have been visible in unbroken clarity. It is here that some researchers see not only a sanctuary of ritual, but a place of observation, a prehistoric observatory where the heavens themselves became part of ceremony. The idea is not without precedent. Across the world, ancient monuments often bear traces of astronomical alignment. Stonehenge in England, thousands of years younger, is famously oriented toward the midsummer sunrise. The temples of Malta, dating to around 3600 BCE, appear to frame celestial events within their doorways. Even the Great Pyramids of Egypt, millennia later, align with cardinal points and perhaps with stellar constellations. In this context, it seems natural to ask whether Göbekli Tepe, older by far than all these examples, might have been the beginning of such traditions. The most frequently discussed evidence comes from the orientations of the enclosures themselves. Archaeologists have noted that some of the circles face particular points on the horizon, where the sun or certain stars would have risen at key times of year. Enclosure D, the most monumental, is oriented roughly to the southeast. Some suggest this alignment corresponds to the rising of Sirius, the brightest star in the sky, which would have become visible in that direction during the 10th millennium BCE. To ancient eyes, the reappearance of Sirius after its annual absence may have signaled the cycle of seasons, a cosmic marker to guide ritual gatherings. Others point to possible solstitial alignments, the rising and setting of the sun at the longest and shortest days of the year. These celestial events would have marked turning points in the calendar, moments when communities might gather to reaffirm their bonds with each other and with the cosmos. If Göbekli Tepe's stones were indeed positioned to frame these events, then the sanctuary was not merely a backdrop for ritual, but an instrument of timekeeping, embedding the rhythm of the sky into the architecture of stone. Yet the evidence is contested. Critics argue that the orientations may be coincidental, the natural result of building enclosures on uneven terrain. Without written records or unambiguous markers, certainty remains elusive. Unlike Stonehenge, where a clear alignment with the solstice sunrise can be experienced directly, Göbekli Tepe's orientations are less exact, open to interpretation. Some scholars caution that to see astronomy in every line of stone may be to project modern categories onto a worldview that was not ours. Still, the symbolic weight of the sky is difficult to dismiss. The Vulture Stone, Pillar 43, has already sparked suggestions that the carvings represent constellations or even a record of a cosmic event, perhaps a comet strike linked to the younger Dryas. Whether or not one accepts this reading, the very possibility speaks to the sense that the builders were attuned to the heavens, the vulture with outstretched wings, the scorpion, the headless man. Such imagery may well reflect more than earthly concerns. The stone seems to whisper of connections between death, renewal, and the endless cycles overhead. If the builders were indeed skywatchers, their motivations may have been as much spiritual as practical. To hunter-gatherer groups living at the dawn of the Neolithic, the sky would have been the most reliable calendar. The return of certain stars, the waxing and waning of the moon, the passage of the sun, all would have guided migrations, hunting seasons, and the timing of gatherings. But beyond practicality lay symbolism. The heavens were a vast theatre in which myth could unfold, a canvas on which the movements of gods, ancestors, and spirits were traced in light. Comparisons with later traditions lend weight to this view. In Mesopotamian cultures thousands of years later, the stars were catalogued and named, their cycles woven into myth and ritual. The Sumerians identified constellations that still form part of our zodiac today. Could Göbekli Tepe represent a distant prelude to this tradition? A first attempt to read meaning in the heavens, centuries before writing or agriculture had fully taken root? The thought is tantalizing, though evidence remains fragmentary. Some researchers propose that gatherings at the sanctuary may have been timed to celestial events. The seasonal return of a star, or the solstice, could have drawn groups from across the region, converging on the hilltop to feast, to build, and to renew their shared cosmology. In this view, the stones were not only monuments but anchors, fixing ritual in time and space, binding community to cosmos. The effort of quarrying, shaping, and raising the great pillars may have been justified not only by devotion to unseen beings, but by the need to align human life with celestial order. Others remain cautious. They note that many enclosures face different directions, with no single unifying pattern. The possibility remains that the builders cared less about precise alignments than about the symbolism of enclosing space itself. The circles may have represented the cosmos in miniature, their central pillars embodying deities or ancestors, while the sky above was simply the natural dome beneath which ritual unfolded. In this interpretation, astronomy is less a science than a symbolic resonance, a backdrop that shaped meaning but was not measured in degrees. And so, the debate continues. Was Göbekli Tepe humanity's first observatory, where the stars themselves were mapped and remembered? Or was it a sanctuary of myth, where celestial cycles were felt but not calculated, woven into story rather than science? The stones do not say. Their orientations remain ambiguous, their carvings silent. What survives is possibility, and the haunting sense that here, on this hill, the line between earth and sky was blurred. Perhaps this is the true significance of Göbekli Tepe's location. To stand atop the ridge is to inhabit both earth and heaven at once. The horizon stretches in every direction, and the dome of the sky feels close, almost tangible. For the builders, this may have been the essence of sacredness, a place where the human world opened directly onto the cosmic, where the dance of stars and the cycle of life could be joined in ritual. As night falls over the site today, and the first stars flicker above the Anatolian plateau, one can almost imagine the gatherings of millennia past. Fires flickering among the stones, voices rising in chant, the heavens overhead serving as both ceiling and calendar. Whether or not they charted the sky with scientific precision, the builders were surely sky watchers, attuned to cycles far greater than themselves, inscribing in stone their reverence for the mysteries above. And yet, as always with Göbekli Tepe, the final answer is withheld. The stones face the horizon, but their meaning remains just beyond reach. Were they windows to the cosmos, or mirrors of human imagination? Were the builders astronomers or storytellers? The sanctuary holds its silence, leaving us to stand where they once stood, watching the same stars rise and fall, asking the same questions, waiting for answers that never come. Chapter 22. Echoes across the world. Megalithic traditions. Across the windswept highlands of southern Anatolia, 11,000 years ago, circles of stone rose into the sky. Their builders left no written words, no villages, no trace of permanent settlement around them. Only the pillars remain, silent, enduring, a sanctuary of memory. Yet the vision embodied at Göbekli Tepe does not remain confined to its own time or place. As we look outward across the vast span of human history, we hear its resonance in the circles of Britain, in the deserts of Egypt, in the green hills of Ireland. Echoes of the same impulse, the raising of megaliths, the aligning of stone with sky, the inscribing of memory into enduring form. To speak of echoes is not to claim a direct line of descent. Archaeologists remind us that proof of connection is elusive. Thousands of years separate Göbekli Tepe from the later megalithic cultures of Europe and Africa. The circles of Stonehenge, for instance, date to around 2500 BCE, some 6.5 millennia after the first enclosures of Göbekli Tepe were raised. The passage tomb of Newgrange in Ireland, aligned to the solstice sunrise, belongs to the same era. Nabta Playa in southern Egypt, a ceremonial site marked by stone circles and alignments to the summer solstice, flourished around 5000 BCE. These monuments appear long after Göbekli Tepe was buried beneath its own mound. And yet, the similarities are undeniable. Stones lifted from the earth, arranged in circles, marked with carvings, pointing to the sky. Consider Stonehenge, rising from the chalk plains of Wiltshire. Its great sarsen trilithons and bluestones form a circle that frames the solstice sun. Though younger by thousands of years, it embodies a vision akin to Göbekli Tepe's, the gathering of community to move stones of impossible weight, to arrange them in patterns that speak not only to earthly life, but to celestial rhythms. The builders of Stonehenge quarried bluestones from the Preseli Hills in Wales, transporting them more than 150 miles to their final resting place. At Göbekli Tepe, stones of 20 to 50 tons were dragged from quarries on the limestone plateau. In both cases, the effort was communal, demanding organization, belief, and a sense of meaning that surpassed mere utility. In the Nubian desert, Nabta Playa reveals another echo. Here, nomadic herders raised megalithic circles around 5000 to 4500 BCE. Some stones align precisely with the rising of Orion's belt at midsummer, suggesting astronomical intent. Water too played a role. The site lies near what was once a seasonal lake, a life-giving oasis in the desert. Ritual feasts, burials, and offerings surround the stone arrangements. Like Göbekli Tepe, Nabta Playa was not a settlement but a gathering place, a sanctuary in a harsh landscape, where stone became the medium through which humans conversed with the cosmos. And far to the northwest, in the green hills of Ireland, Newgrange stands as one of the most powerful megalithic monuments of Europe. Built around 3200 BCE, its great passage tomb extends into a mound of earth and stone, culminating in a chamber illuminated only on the morning of the winter solstice. On that day, a shaft of sunlight pierces the darkness, striking the inner chamber, binding the dead to the eternal cycles of the sun. Carved spirals and geometric forms adorn the stones, their meaning still debated, symbols of eternity, of journeys, of cycles without end. At Göbekli Tepe, too, animals and symbols were carved into limestone, their meanings obscured but undeniably sacred. Both sites embody the same impulse, to inscribe meaning into stone, to tether human memory to the great rhythms of time. Are these similarities coincidence, or are they echoes of a deeper, older memory? Some scholars have speculated that the megalithic tradition may have a common root, that the impulse born at Göbekli Tepe spread outward, carried by migrating peoples across millennia. Others caution against such direct lines, pointing instead to the universality of human concerns: death, the sky, the cycles of the sun and stars. Wherever humans have sought to anchor themselves against the vastness of time, they have turned to stone, the most enduring of materials. Archaeology hesitates to draw connections without evidence, yet the mythic imagination cannot help but hear resonance. The idea that Göbekli Tepe, as the oldest known sanctuary of stone, might stand at the dawn of a tradition that later flowered in Ireland, England, and Egypt is compelling. It suggests a continuity of vision, that humanity, wherever it wandered, carried with it not only tools and fire, but a memory of sacred architecture, of circles raised in alignment with the cosmos. But there is also the possibility of parallel invention. Independent cultures, facing the same mysteries of life and death, the same awe of the sky, may have arrived at similar solutions. Stone is universal. It is heavy, enduring, resistant to time. To raise it is to defy mortality, to set human intention into the fabric of the earth. Whether through shared memory or parallel impulse, The megaliths of the world stand as responses to the same existential questions. Göbekli Tepe's uniqueness lies in its age. Long before farming villages and cities, before kings and temples, before writing and metal, hunter-gatherers gathered here to shape stone into sanctuary. In this sense, it is the primordial ancestor of megalithic architecture, not necessarily by bloodline, but by archetype. It shows us that the impulse to raise stone was not born with agriculture, but deeper in the Paleolithic heart of humanity, in the minds of those who still roamed with wild herds and lived beneath unbroken skies. The echoes stretch even further. On the island of Malta, megalithic temples such as Hagar Kim and Menajdra, dating to around 3600 BCE, align with solstices and equinoxes, their stones forming corridors of light. In Brittany, France, the great alignments of Karnak stretch for miles, rows of standing stones whose purpose remains enigmatic. Across the Atlantic, though far younger, cultures in the Andes raise their own monumental stone sanctuaries, binding earth and sky together in architecture of endurance. Each of these, in its own way, participates in the same mystery: stone as mediator between humanity and cosmos. What is it in stone that calls us back again and again, across continents and millennia? Perhaps it is endurance. Where wood rots and memory fades, stone remains. To carve into it is to resist time, to declare that meaning should not vanish with the breath of a single generation. Perhaps it is weight. To move stone requires community, shared vision, and ritual purpose. In raising stones, societies raise themselves, binding individuals into a collective act of transformation. At Göbekli Tepe, the stones rise in circles, each one a cosmos unto itself. At Stonehenge, they frame the sky. At Newgrange, they channel light into darkness. At Nabta Playa, they mark the rhythm of the stars. Different expressions, yet the same language. Stone as sacred, stone as memory, stone as mediator. And still, we do not know if the echo is lineage or coincidence. Did the memory of Göbekli Tepe's circles ripple outward through forgotten migrations, carried in the songs and stories of millennia? Or did humanity, confronted again and again by death and cosmos, rediscover the same solution wherever it wandered? The stones do not answer. They endure in silence, bearing witness but not explanation. What they leave us is resonance, the recognition that across the world, across vast stretches of time, humanity has turned to stone to express what words could not. And so, as we stand amid the ruins of Göbekli Tepe, and then among the circles of Britain, the deserts of Egypt, the green hills of Ireland, we feel a continuity of spirit. We sense that the impulse to build in stone is not an isolated invention, but part of the human inheritance, a memory that transcends geography, a rhythm that returns again and again. The echo remains unresolved, whether carried across generations or born anew in distant lands. But in that uncertainty lies the deeper truth, that humanity, in every age, has sought to speak with eternity through the medium of stone. Chapter 23. The end of the sanctuary. By the dawn of the 8th millennium BCE, something shifted upon the limestone ridge of Göbekli Tepe. The once living sanctuary, where hunters, gatherers, and perhaps early farmers converged beneath towering pillars, fell silent. No new enclosures were raised. No new feasts resounded across the plateau. Instead, the stones were gradually buried, intentionally entombed beneath layers of rubble and refuse. What had once been the heart of ritual activity became a sealed mound, hidden from sight for nearly 10,000 years. Archaeologists today see this act not as one of neglect, but of intention. The fill that buried the great circles was not natural drift, nor the careless piling of earth by the wind. It was deliberate, composed of broken stone, flint tools, animal bones, and domestic debris. It is as though the builders themselves had chosen to end the life of the sanctuary by encasing it in a funerary shroud of their own making. In this, the site itself became a body, ritually interred at the close of its era. The question, of course, is why? By around 8000 BCE, the Near East was undergoing a profound transformation. Across the Fertile Crescent, farming had begun to take root. Wild grains, long harvested in the hills of southeastern Anatolia, were now being cultivated deliberately. Sheep and goats, once hunted in their herds, were being tamed, bred, and corralled. Settlements were appearing with increasing permanence. Clusters of houses with hearths, courtyards, and burials beneath the floors. Life was moving from the seasonal and the transient toward the enduring and domestic. In such a world, the Hilltop sanctuary may have lost its necessity. For generations, it had been a place where scattered bands came together, united by ritual feasting and shared construction. But as agriculture tied people more closely to their fields and villages, the rhythms of life changed. The sanctuary may no longer have been the nexus of community. Its role as a gathering place was slowly eclipsed by the hearth and the household, where shrines and rituals now emerged in more intimate spaces. Some scholars suggest that Göbekli Tepe was abandoned because its purpose had been fulfilled. It had been the stage upon which humanity first inscribed its myths in stone, a crucible for the forging of symbols and social bonds. Once farming took hold, these same myths could be carried into daily life, embedded in houses, in villages, in new forms of worship. The sanctuary on the hill was no longer required, and so it was ritually closed, its memory preserved, but its use discontinued. Others see a different story. They suggest that new social structures, born of agriculture, displaced the old order. The cooperative bands that once raised stones together gave way to communities with leaders, hierarchies, and divisions of labour. The monumental sanctuaries of hunter-gatherers no longer fit this new world of villages and fields. In such a scenario, Göbekli Tepe may not have been reverently retired, but actively suppressed, a relic of a vanishing way of life, deliberately buried so that its power would not linger in the age to come. The careful nature of the backfilling, however, resists simple explanations. If this were mere abandonment, the stones would have been left to weather and crumble. Instead, they were sealed, protected in their entombment. Was this an act of reverence? A closing of the circle in ritual form? Or was it an act of concealment, a way of hiding sacred knowledge from those uninitiated in its mysteries? The silence of the site after burial is striking. For nearly 10 millennia, the mound lay undisturbed. No village rose upon it. No later builders repurposed its stones. This absence itself may carry meaning. Perhaps the hill retained a reputation of sanctity or danger, a place avoided out of respect or fear. Oral traditions may have preserved its significance long after its enclosures were covered, ensuring that it remained untouched until the modern age. Archaeologists continue to debate whether the act of closure at Göbekli Tepe was unique or part of a broader pattern. At other early Neolithic sites, ritual spaces were also buried or remodeled in ways that suggest symbolic closure. The tradition of plastering skulls at Jericho or entombing shrines at Çatalhöyük speaks of a worldview in which sacred spaces were not abandoned casually, but transformed and sealed when their time was complete. Göbekli Tepe might represent the most monumental example of this tradition, a ritualized farewell to an era of belief. The end of the sanctuary coincides with another great transition, the spread of symbolic expression into new mediums. The monumental reliefs of Göbekli Tepe, carved on massive pillars, gave way in later sites to smaller household shrines, painted walls, and portable figurines. The scale of sacred art shifted from the vast to the intimate, from the collective to the personal. In this sense, the burial of the enclosures may have marked not only the end of a site, but the passing of an age of monumentality itself. And yet, the meaning of this act remains out of reach. Was it gratitude, an honouring of stones that had served their people well? Was it fear, an attempt to bury powers that no longer belonged in the new order of villages and fields? Or was it something we cannot yet imagine, a symbolic act rooted in a cosmology wholly alien to our own? When modern excavators uncovered the buried circles, they found them remarkably preserved, as though sealed for us to rediscover at the threshold of our own age of questioning. It is tempting to see this as a kind of message across time, a deliberate act of preservation by people who, on some level, knew that their sanctuary might one day speak again. But perhaps that is merely our projection, our desire to find continuity in the face of silence. What is certain is that Göbekli Tepe's end is as enigmatic as its beginning. The first shovelfuls of backfill mark the close of a chapter in human history, one written not in words, but in stone and silence. Its burial ensured that it would not be destroyed by the elements, nor by the hands of later generations. Instead, it slumbered beneath the earth, waiting for the moment when it would rise again into our awareness. And so, as with so many aspects of Göbekli Tepe, the story concludes not with answers, but with questions. Why did its builders choose to bury their sanctuary? What new world emerged as the old one was entombed? Was the hilltop left behind because life had changed, or because its mysteries had grown too great to endure? The sanctuary's stones remain where they were placed 12,000 years ago, sealed, reopened, and still echoing with silence. Its end remains a puzzle, a quiet reminder that all monuments, no matter how enduring, are subject to the tides of time, and that sometimes the most lasting act is not in building, but in burying. Chapter 24. Who were the builders? Who were the people who carved lions and foxes into stone, who raised T-shaped pillars higher than themselves, and who buried their creation beneath layers of earth as if to seal away its memory? This is the haunting question that hovers over Göbekli Tepe. The site gives us stones, carvings, and alignments, but it does not give us names. It does not yield the voices of its builders. Archaeologists, faced with this silence, label them pre-pottery Neolithic hunter-gatherers. Yet even that term feels inadequate, a technical box that cannot contain the scale of their vision. For here, on the limestone plateau of southern Anatolia, people who had no pottery, no wheels, no written script, raised what is today recognized as the world's first known monumental sanctuary. To imagine them is to step into a world at the cusp of transformation. The date is around 9600 BCE at the dawn of the Neolithic. The Ice Age has only recently released its grip. Glaciers retreat, climates warm, wild grasses flourish in the Fertile Crescent. Across these lands, communities of hunter-gatherers follow gazelle, onager, and aurochs. They forage for pistachios, almonds, and wild barley. They move seasonally, carrying with them tools of flint and bone. There is no evidence that they live in permanent villages near Göbekli Tepe, and yet, when the time comes, they converge upon this hilltop to carve, to lift, and to build. How and why? One interpretation suggests that these were mobile bands, scattered across the region, who gathered in great numbers at certain times of year. Perhaps during seasonal hunts or ritual festivals tied to the stars, they came together in a temporary unity. Their separate identities dissolved into a larger purpose: to raise stone, to carve symbols, to participate in ceremonies whose meaning is now lost to us. Once the rituals ended, they dispersed again, carrying stories of what they had seen and done, binding the scattered peoples of Anatolia into a shared symbolic world. Another possibility envisions them as proto-farmers, standing on the threshold of domestication. Recent discoveries show that around the same time, wild einkorn wheat was being gathered and perhaps cultivated near Karaka Dağ, just 40 kilometers from Göbekli Tepe. Was the act of gathering here, of feasting and building, a catalyst for new ways of life? Did ritual precede agriculture, with the need to feed large groups inspiring the first deliberate cultivation of plants? If so, Göbekli Tepe becomes not just a sanctuary, but a spark that ignited the shift from foraging to farming. And then there is the deeper mystery. Could the builders represent a symbolic culture far older than we imagine, a lineage of thought and myth whose material traces have largely vanished? Their craftsmanship suggests not only strength and coordination, but also vision, a symbolic imagination capable of conceiving of gods, ancestors, or cosmic beings, and of expressing those concepts through abstract art and monumental architecture. They were not primitive. They were artists, astronomers, and engineers, though we lack the language they spoke or the stories they told. What is most striking is their anonymity. At later sites, Uruk, Giza, Rome, we know the names of kings and scribes, the languages of hymns and laws. At Göbekli Tepe, there are no inscriptions, no images of rulers, no claims of ownership, only symbols carved into stone. Foxes, vultures, snakes, headless humans, abstract forms. It is as if the builders chose not to depict themselves fully, as if humanity itself was not the subject of their sanctuaries, but rather the medium. They stood between animals, ancestors, and the cosmos, never placing themselves at the center. Archaeologists such as Klaus Schmidt, who first excavated the site in the 1990s, emphasized that the builders were hunter-gatherers, yet ones with a complexity and vision far exceeding earlier expectations. For decades, the prevailing model of prehistory held that religion and monumental architecture came after farming. That complex symbolic culture required stable villages and surpluses. Göbekli Tepe overturned that assumption. Here, ritual seems to have preceded settlement. Belief may have been the driving force that shaped practical innovation, not the other way around. And yet, the enigma deepens. No graves of builders have been found. No permanent houses cluster around the hill. The site seems set apart, deliberately outside the realm of daily life. This raises questions. Who organized the labor to carve and transport stones weighing up to 50 tons? What social structures existed to coordinate feasts, rituals, and construction? Was there leadership, shamans, elders, or priestly figures? Or was the labor distributed across equals united by a common vision? The absence of clear hierarchy in the archaeological record leaves the question open. Some researchers suggest that the builders may have been bound together not by kings or chiefs, but by shared myth. The imagery of predators, lions, leopards, snakes, suggests a world of spirits and powers, a cosmology in which the human role was small, perhaps even precarious. Rituals may have centered on death and transformation, with vultures carrying the souls of the dead skyward, as depicted on the carved pillars. In such a world, building Göbekli Tepe was not merely construction, it was participation in the cosmic order, a collective act of meaning-making. Others have speculated more boldly. Could the builders represent a cultural horizon now lost to time? A people whose myths and practices seeded later traditions? Some see in Göbekli Tepe the germ of Mesopotamian religion, the foreshadowing of temples and ziggurats, even echoes of Edenic myths preserved in later scripture. Yet such links remain speculative. What we can say is that the builders carried within them the capacity for abstraction, ritual, and architectural imagination long before cities rose on the plains below. Their anonymity, paradoxically, amplifies their voice. By erasing themselves, by leaving behind only animals, symbols, and stones, they force us to confront the depth of our ignorance. We cannot name them, but we walk in the presence of their work. We cannot read their stories, but we sense that they understood things about death, cosmos, and community that remain relevant even now. Perhaps it is fitting that they remain unknown. To name them would be to reduce the mystery to a single identity, a single culture. But Göbekli Tepe speaks to something broader. The human capacity to imagine beyond survival, to carve eternity from stone, to gather together for reasons that transcend necessity. Whoever the builders were, they remind us that civilization's roots are not simple, linear, or bound to the inventions we usually count as progress. They remind us that imagination itself may be the oldest technology of all. The question lingers, unresolved. Were they seasonal nomads, proto-farmers, or something more? The stones refuse to answer. They endure in silence, awaiting interpretation. The builders vanish into anonymity, but their sanctuary endures, whispering across 12 millennia that humanity's beginnings were stranger, older, and more visionary than we once believed. And as the sun sets over the limestone plateau, casting long shadows across the buried enclosures, we are left with that silence, a silence that is not empty, but filled with memory. It is the silence of people whose names we do not know, whose lives we cannot trace, but whose vision still stands, etched into stone, awaiting us to listen more deeply.